The day Evelyn Hart arrived in Bitter Creek, Montana, the temperature was 11 degrees below zero and falling. She knew that because the station master told her so, not as a warning, just as a fact, the way men in this part of the world announce things they considered obvious. He said it while she was still stepping down from the train, her boot catching the ice-slicked platform edge so that she had to grab the iron railing with both hands to keep from going down. He didn't offer to help. He was already walking back toward the warmth of his little building, the words floating behind him in a cloud of frozen breath. 11 below, falling. Evelyn straightened herself, adjusted the grip on her traveling bag, and looked at the town. It was nothing like the letter had described. The letter, written in a careful, looping hand that she now suspected belonged to someone paid to write it, had mentioned a thriving community. It had mentioned opportunity and good land and a need for capable women willing to build something in the Montana Territory. What it hadn't mentioned was the way the wind came off the mountains and cut straight through wool like it wasn't there, or the way the main street sat ankle-deep in gray, packed snow, wagon ruts frozen solid into ridges that could turn an ankle in the dark, or the smell of livestock and wood smoke that hung over everything, permanent as weather. She had come from Boston, not wealthy Boston, not the brownstone and carriage Boston that people back east like to imagine when they thought of the city. She had come from the other Boston, the cramped boarding house and factory work Boston, where women like her spent their best years bent over machinery or someone else's laundry, slowly spending down whatever youth they'd had. She was 31 years old. She had a brown wool coat that was decent, but not warm enough, a traveling bag with 2 changes of clothes and a small photograph she rarely looked at anymore, and 17 cents in her coat pocket. She had answered the advertisement 6 weeks ago because she had nothing left to lose. That was the honest truth of it, though she hadn't said so in the letter she'd written back. She'd written that she was hardworking and capable and eager for a fresh start. All of that was true enough. But the deeper truth was simpler and uglier. She had nowhere else to go. A man named Gerald Potts met her at the end of the platform. He was the one who'd arranged the whole thing, a self-appointed matchmaker who'd been running mail-order bride arrangements for the settlement churches for 3 years, he told her. And with considerable success, he added, with the particular emphasis of a man who knows he's trying to sell something. "You'll meet the men at the church," he said, not looking at her directly, steering her toward a waiting wagon. "There's 23 of them who expressed interest." 23, she said. "Good number. You'll find someone suitable." She climbed into the wagon. The seat was a bare plank of frozen wood, and she felt it through her coat immediately. Potts clucked at the horse, and they lurched forward down the main street. She watched the town go past. A general store, a saloon with its shutters half closed against the cold, a blacksmith's, a feed supply, a cluster of low buildings whose purposes she couldn't determine. A few people moved on the street, bundled so heavily it was impossible to tell much about them. No one looked at the wagon. "How does this work?" she asked. "The meeting." "They'll come to the church one at a time," Potts said. "Speak with you, ask their questions. If they're satisfied, they'll indicate interest. If you're both agreeable, arrangements can be made." "And if none of them are satisfied?" Potts was quiet for a moment. "There's a train back east on Friday," he said. She heard what he didn't say, that this was the arrangement, that the train was the other option, that this was the last option. The church was a plain wooden building at the end of the street, heated by a single iron stove that was doing its best against the cold and mostly losing. Someone had put pine boughs near the front as a concession to decoration. The smell of evergreen and wood smoke was almost pleasant. Almost. Evelyn sat in a chair near the stove and waited. The first man came in at 9 in the morning. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, with the careful look of someone who had been told to be polite. He sat across from her and asked her age and her experience with livestock. She answered honestly. He nodded several times, slowly, and then asked if she'd ever done a full winter in serious cold. "No," she said. He stood up and offered her a courtesy nod and left. The second man was younger, maybe mid-30s, with red roughened hands and a nervous way of pulling at the brim of his hat. He asked if she could cook. She said yes. He asked what she could cook. She listed several things. He asked if she'd ever cooked for more than 3 people. She said she'd worked in a boarding house kitchen for 2 years, which was true. She had done that before the factory work. He seemed to consider this carefully. Then he asked her to stand up. "Stand up?" she said. "Need to see if you're sturdy enough." he said. Not unkindly, but plainly, the way you might assess a horse. She stood up. He looked at her for a moment, at her height, which was average, at her frame, which was slim but not frail. And she saw the assessment happening in his face, and she held herself very still and didn't let what she was feeling show. She had practice at that. He shook his head slightly and left. That was how the morning went. By noon, she had spoken with 11 men. By noon, all 11 had left without indicating interest. The reasons varied, though they were rarely stated outright. Too slight, too old, too Eastern. One man, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at her for approximately 40 seconds and then told Gerald Potts, who was hovering in the doorway, that he'd been expecting someone more robust. He said the word robust like it was a technical term, which for his purposes she supposed it was. She sat by the stove and ate the lunch Potts brought her, beans and bread, which was adequate, and looked at the pine boughs and thought about the 17 cents in her pocket. She thought about the train on Friday. She thought about where she would go if she got on it, and the answer, as always, was nowhere particularly good. The afternoon men were no better. The 13th rejected her after 2 minutes of conversation, during which he asked about her family in Boston, and she told him, honestly, that she didn't have much family left. He frowned at this like it was a personal failing, which perhaps it was. The 16th asked her if she was healthy. She said she was. He asked if she'd had any serious illness. She said she'd had a bad winter fever several years ago, but had recovered fully. He thanked her politely and left. The 19th barely sat down. By the time the 20th man left, the church was getting colder. The fire had burned lower, and Gerald Potts had gone to get more wood and hadn't come back yet. And Evelyn sat alone in the silence of the near dark and felt the particular kind of tiredness that isn't about sleep. She was tired of being assessed. She was tired of the careful, detached looks that measured her and found her lacking. Not as a person. None of them had spoken to her long enough to find her lacking as a person, but as a thing, a resource, a practical solution to a practical problem, and she wasn't practical enough. She was not a woman given to self-pity. Life hadn't offered her much opportunity to indulge it, and she'd learned early that it didn't accomplish anything useful. But sitting there in the cooling church with the gray afternoon light coming through the single window, she let herself feel it for just a moment, the full weight of how very alone she was, how far she was from anything familiar, how thoroughly she had gambled on this, and how completely she seemed to be losing. Then she straightened her spine and folded her hands in her lap and waited for the 21st man. He was a farmer from outside of town who smelled strongly of something she couldn't identify, and who spent the entire conversation looking slightly to the left of her face, as though speaking directly to her might be some kind of commitment. He left after 4 minutes. 22 was a widower. He told her that immediately, with 2 grown sons. He seemed more measured than the others, more thoughtful, and for a few minutes she thought perhaps. But then he asked about her experience with dairy cattle specifically, and when she admitted she had none, something closed in his expression, and he thanked her and put his hat back on. 23 came in as the sun was going, the winter dark arriving early the way it did this far north, dropping like something solid. He was a younger man, maybe late 20s, with an open, honest face and a nervous energy about him. He sat down and talked to her genuinely for nearly 10 minutes, about the territory, about what life was like, about what he was hoping for. She answered honestly, and he seemed to listen. She thought this was real. She thought this was possibly it. At the end of 10 minutes, he said, "You seem like a fine woman, ma'am. Truly, I mean that." And then he looked at his hands and said, "But I need someone who can handle this country. And I'm not sure, I'm sorry, I don't mean any offense, but I'm not sure you're built for it." She said, "I understand." She said it quietly and steadily. And she watched him leave, and then she was alone in the church with the fire that had burned down to almost nothing and the pine boughs that were starting to look a little tired, and she thought, Friday, there's a train on Friday. The door opened again. She didn't look up immediately. She thought it was Gerald Potts with the wood he'd never brought. She was staring at the floor, doing the arithmetic of her situation, trying to figure out if 17 cents could extend to any kind of solution. And then the silence went on long enough that she looked up. There was a man standing just inside the door. He hadn't come all the way in. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the particular physical solidity of someone who'd spent a great many years doing hard outdoor work. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a beard that hadn't been trimmed recently, though not from neglect, she thought, just from not having gotten to it. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat still dusted with snow, which meant he'd come some distance in the weather. He was looking at her, not assessing her, not measuring her, just looking at her, directly, the way people sometimes looked at each other before they'd decided anything yet. "I was told there were men seeing you today," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "There were," she said. 23 of them. Something moved in his expression. "And none of them—" "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He came further into the church, far enough to stop being in the doorway, and she could see him more clearly now. He had lines around his eyes and a weariness about him that wasn't the kind that came from a hard day's work, but from something that went deeper. She recognized that kind of weariness. She had seen it in mirrors. "I'm Jonah Cole," he said. "I have a ranch about 9 miles out, northeast." "Evelyn Hart," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm late. There were things at the ranch that kept me." She waited. "I have 4 children," he said. "Oldest is 14. Youngest just turned 5. Their mother died 2 years ago. Winter fever." He paused. "The ranch is hard. The winters here are serious. I'm not going to tell you otherwise." "I appreciate that," she said. "I need someone who can run a household and be a steady presence for those children," he said. "I don't need someone who's been doing this their whole life. I need someone who won't quit when it gets hard." He stopped. "That's probably not the thing to say to a woman who's been sitting here all day being told no." "It's an honest thing to say," she said. "I prefer honest." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Will you come out to the ranch?" She looked at him. She thought about Friday. She thought about 17 cents and nowhere to go. She thought about the way he was looking at her, not like a resource, not like something to be assessed, just like a person he was asking a question to. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." They left Bitter Creek before dawn the next morning. Jonah had stayed at the boarding house on the far end of town. Gerald Potts had arranged a room for him. And he came to collect her while it was still dark, the wagon already loaded with the supplies he'd come to town for. She had almost nothing to load. Her one bag fit in the back without rearranging anything. She climbed up to the wagon seat and he handed her an extra blanket without comment, just held it out and waited until she took it, and then he got up beside her and started the horse. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders over her coat, and they went out of Bitter Creek into the dark and the cold. He didn't talk much, and she didn't either. She had learned early not to fill silence with sound just because it was there. She watched the territory go past as dawn came up slowly, gray first, and then a particular pale orange-pink that she had to admit was something she hadn't seen before. The way it sat along the line of mountains to the east, and then the sun came up fully, and the snow everywhere turned briefly brilliant. It hurt her eyes, and she squinted against it, and beside her she heard Jonah make a low sound. Not quite a word. "Beautiful," she said. "It gets that way sometimes," he said. "First winter here, I thought it was worth anything, a sky like that. By the 3rd winter, I just thought it was cold." She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his breath coming in slow clouds. "Which winter are you on now?" she asked. 7th, he said. "I still think it's cold." A pause. "But you still notice it," she said. He glanced at her then, just briefly. "I still notice it," he agreed. They rode in silence for a while. The snow-covered land unrolled around them, cut through with the line of the trail, and occasionally she could see the track of animals. The pressed-down print of deer, a winding rodent trail. And the sky above was a hard, clear blue, entirely without clouds. She thought about what he'd said the night before. 4 children. 9 miles northeast. Hard winters. "The children," she said. "What are their names?" "Mason's 14. He takes things hard, feels everything hard. His mother's death was difficult for him." A pause. "He still is difficult." "Nora's 11. She manages herself. Always has, even when she was small. She'll be watching you close, though. She doesn't say much about what she thinks, but she's thinking it. Luke is 8. He's easy enough. Follows Mason's lead more than I'd like." "And the little one," she said. "Ivy. Ivy just turned 5 in September. His voice changed slightly on the name, just slightly, a softening that she suspected he wouldn't have allowed if he'd been aware of it. She doesn't remember her mother much. Not really. She was 3 when... He stopped. I understand, Evelyn said. He nodded once and didn't say anything more about it. She didn't push. Some things needed their own time. The ranch appeared around a bend in the trail, backed against a rise of land that broke the worst of the north wind. It was not large. A main house, a barn that was bigger than the house, 2 outbuildings, a corral where several horses stood in the cold, but it was solid-looking. The house had been built with some care for permanence, thick log walls and a good roof, though it needed work here and there that she could see even from a distance. A curl of smoke came from the chimney. Someone had kept the fire going. As they came into the yard, the front door opened and a boy appeared on the step. Mason was 14 but looked older, tall already, broad in the shoulders in a way that suggested he'd be a large man, with dark eyes and a set to his jaw that was probably inherited. He watched the wagon come in without changing his expression. She noticed he was wearing a coat that was too small for him, the sleeves ending 3 inches above his wrists. Behind him came a girl who had to be Nora, dark-haired, serious-faced, watching everything from slightly back in the doorway. Then Luke appeared beside Mason, younger and smaller, and with more of his father's face, and he looked at the wagon with open, uncomplicated curiosity. There was no sign of Ivy yet. Jonah pulled the horse up and climbed down, and Evelyn did the same, her boots crunching in the packed snow of the yard. Jonah said, "This is Miss Evelyn Hart. She's come to help with the house." He said it plainly, without ceremony. Mason looked at her. "How long?" he said. "Mason," Jonah said, a single word, a warning. "It's a fair question," Mason said, not backing down. "The last one was here 3 weeks." "It's a fair question," Evelyn said, and Mason looked at her, a little surprised, she thought, that she'd said so. "I don't know how long. I'm here now and I intend to stay. Past that, I can't promise anything except that I won't leave without telling you why." Mason looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at his father, and then looked somewhere else entirely, which was neither acceptance nor refusal. She supposed that was reasonable enough. Luke said, "Can you make biscuits?" "Luke," Nora said. "I can," Evelyn said. "Is that a priority for you?" "Mason says nobody here can make biscuits right," Luke said. "Not since—" He stopped. Nora had put a hand on his arm. "I'll make biscuits tomorrow morning," Evelyn said. "You can tell me if they're right or not." She picked up her bag from the back of the wagon and followed Jonah toward the house. As she reached the door, she heard a small sound from inside, somewhere deeper in the house, and when she stepped through into the dim warmth, wood smoke and animal smell and something baking, someone had put a pot on, a small figure appeared from behind the table. Ivy Cole had her mother's eyes, probably. Evelyn didn't know that. She had no way of knowing that. But there was something in the child's face that didn't quite match the others, some quality that seemed separate, apart. She had dark curly hair, and she was holding a wooden horse in both hands, and she was staring at Evelyn with the complete, unguarded attention of a 5-year-old who hasn't yet learned to hide what she's thinking. "Are you the new lady?" Ivy said. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Yes." Ivy considered this. "Do you know how to braid hair?" Evelyn almost laughed, managed not to. "I do." "Papa can't do braids," Ivy said with the certainty of long experience. "He tries, but they fall out." "I'll work on that," Jonah said from behind Evelyn, and she heard something in his voice, the same softening she'd heard on the trail, the smallest yielding. He had a sense of humor buried somewhere under all the rest of it, she thought. That was something. She was given the small room off the kitchen. It had a cot, a chest with 2 drawers, and a window that looked out toward the barn. The window had a gap at the bottom where the cold came in, and she stuffed it with a piece of cloth she found in the chest, and that helped some. She put her bag on the floor by the cot and stood for a moment looking at the room. Not much to it. Smaller than the room at the boarding house in Boston, which itself had not been large. But the cot had 2 blankets, and the room was warm from the kitchen stove adjacent, and the walls were solid. She had had worse. She found her way around the kitchen before supper. It was a decent kitchen for the territory. Good iron stove, a proper work table, shelves with the staples in reasonable order, though the flour barrel was getting low and the salt pork situation needed attention. She made a mental note of what was needed. She made a lot of mental notes that first afternoon, walking the house, looking at what there was and what there wasn't, and what needed doing. The children watched her from various distances. Nora followed her at a careful remove, never close enough to be considered following, but always nearby, always watching. Luke tried to talk to her twice and got pulled away by Nora both times, though once, when Nora wasn't looking, he slipped her a question about whether she'd ever seen a real bear, which she hadn't, and he seemed to find this interesting rather than disappointing. Mason didn't come back inside until supper. He'd been in the barn all afternoon, which Jonah told her, when she asked, was where Mason went when he needed to be by himself. "He's out there a lot," she said. "Since his mother passed," Jonah said. He said it without looking at her, standing at the door to the barnyard, checking the sky the way people here check the sky constantly, assessing weather. She could see him cataloging it, the feel of the temperature, the quality of the clouds building to the northwest. Some calculation she didn't have the experience to make. "Snow tonight," he said. "How much?" He thought about it. "Some," he said. "Not a bad storm. But it'll be cold." This turned out to be accurate. She was up twice in the night to put more wood on the kitchen stove, and she lay on the cot under both blankets and listened to the wind and tried to get a sense of this place, this territory, this particular cold that was different from the cold she'd known. It wasn't just temperature. It was weight. It settled on everything like an intention. She had 3 days before she fully understood that she was not, in fact, prepared for this. She had thought she was capable. She had thought her time in the boarding house kitchen, her 2 years at the factory, her general stubbornness and willingness to work. She had thought these things would carry her. And to a point, they did. She was not afraid of work. She was up before the household and had the fire built up and the coffee on before anyone else came down. And she learned the stove quickly, its quirks and preferences, the spots where it ran hot, and the way you had to feed it birch in the mornings. She could cook adequately. The biscuits she'd promised were acceptable, not perfect. She'd never used this particular flour, ground coarser than she was used to, and the first batch came out a little dense. But Luke declared them fine, and Ivy ate 3, and even Mason, who ate without saying anything, ate 2, which she took as something. But the land, the cold, the relentlessness of it. On the 4th day, Jonah put her on a horse for the first time, and she discovered that she did not know how to ride. Not really. Not in any way that was useful here. She'd had a few experiences as a girl with a friend's old mare, plodding around a paddock, and she'd thought that counted for something. It did not count for much here. The horse she was given was a dun gelding of considerable patience, but she still nearly came off 3 times on the quarter-mile ride to check the south fence line. And when they arrived, she was gripping the saddle horn with both hands and her thighs were shaking. Jonah said nothing critical. He just said, "You'll get used to it." And she thought, maybe. Mason was with them that morning, working the fence where a post had shifted in the cold. He watched her dismount with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between amusement and assessment. When she'd steadied herself and turned to help with the fence, even if she didn't yet know what helping would mean, he said, "The last one cried the first time she got on a horse." "I didn't cry," she said. "No," he said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a concession, but something adjacent to it. "You didn't." He went back to the fence post. She watched him work for a moment. He was strong for his age, efficient with the mallet, and he knew what he was doing. And she thought about what Jonah had said. Feels everything hard. She could see it. There was a tightness around him, a held quality, like a closed fist. She handed him nails when he asked for them. She held the post while he packed the frozen ground around the base. She didn't try to talk. After a while, they found a working rhythm, the 3 of them, in the cold and the quiet, and it was enough. The evenings were the hardest. Not hardest for her, particularly. She was usually so tired by evening that the hard part was staying awake long enough to help with supper, but hardest in terms of the family. The table was a complicated place. Jonah sat at the head of it and talked when there was something to say, and was quiet when there wasn't. And Luke chattered steadily about the things a curious 8-year-old chatters about. And Nora managed her own plate with careful efficiency, watching everything. Ivy mostly talked to her wooden horse. And Mason. Mason sat at the table and ate and did not look at Evelyn. Not hostilely, not coldly, just not. Like she wasn't quite there yet. Not as a real presence. Like she was a condition of his environment rather than a person in it. She had seen it before, that particular kind of not seen. She understood it in its way. On the sixth evening, she was washing the supper dishes and Mason came in for water, and she said, without turning around from the basin, "Your coat's too small." A pause. "I know," he said. "The sleeves are nearly to your elbows." "I know that too." She turned then. He was standing by the water pail with his cup, not hostile, just waiting. "There's fabric in the chest in the front room," she said. "I saw it when I was looking for a mending needle. Good heavy wool, enough to let out the sleeves properly or piece a new cuff." He looked at her. "You sew?" "Not well," she said, "but well enough for a cuff. If you want to bring the coat by on Sunday, I can look at it." He didn't say anything, but that Sunday, the coat appeared on the table in the kitchen, folded neat. She worked on it for an hour in the afternoon light, and she did a reasonable job, not elegant but solid, and the sleeves came down properly. She left it back on the table without making any comment about it. The next morning it was gone. She didn't know if he'd said thank you to Jonah or not. He didn't say anything to her, but that evening at the table she caught him looking at the cuffs once, just once, checking them without trying to look like he was checking them. She looked back at her plate. Small things. Building slow. The days had their shape quickly. Up before dawn, fire and coffee, breakfast, then the work of the ranch which she was learning, imperfectly, alongside everything else. There was the matter of the chickens, which she had not particularly prepared for. A man in Boston had kept chickens behind his shop, and she had found them contemptible creatures and had not updated this opinion. And the twice-daily watering and feed for the horses in the barn, and the wood that needed splitting and stacking, and the ongoing battle against the cold that crept under doors and through window gaps and demanded constant response. She learned that wood heat was not the same as the coal stove at the boarding house. She learned that you couldn't bank a wood fire quite the same way, that different wood burned at different rates, that birch was good for starting but pine held longer, that the particular iron stove in this kitchen had its own personality and you had to know it. She singed her arm twice in the first week, just above the wrist, not badly, but enough to sting. Jonah noticed and didn't comment. Nora noticed and brought her a piece of damp cloth without comment. That was the kind of thing Nora did. Practical, unprompted, without making anything of it. She tried to earn Nora's trust directly, once, toward the end of the second week. They were in the kitchen together in the afternoon, Evelyn making bread and Nora doing her schoolwork at the table, and Evelyn said, "You're good at arithmetic." Nora looked up. "How do you know?" "I can see your sums from here," she said. "You're fast." Nora looked down at her work, a pause. "Mama used to help me with school," she said. "Was she good at arithmetic?" "Better than me." A longer pause. "She was good at a lot of things." "I expect she was," Evelyn said. "Are you going to try to be like her?" Nora said. The question was direct, careful, the question of a child who had thought about this. Evelyn stopped kneading the bread for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm not going to try to be like her. I didn't know her. And you don't need another version of her. You just need someone who can take care of things and be here." Nora looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "The last woman who came here tried to rearrange everything. She said Mama's way of doing things was wrong." "That was a foolish thing to do," Evelyn said. Another silence. Nora said, "The one before her left in the second week, just gone one morning." "I'm not going to do that," Evelyn said. "You might," Nora said. Not mean, just honest. "I might," Evelyn admitted. "I won't know until I've been here long enough to know, but I'm not leaving this week or next month. That much I can tell you." Nora went back to her sums. After a while she said without looking up, "I'll help you with the bread. Mama had a way of doing it. I remember how." "Show me," Evelyn said, and stepped back from the table. By the end of the third week, she was not comfortable exactly. She thought perhaps comfort was not the thing this place offered, not in winter. But she was finding her footing. She knew the stove. She knew the horses' names and some of their personalities. She knew that Luke was afraid of the dark and left a lamp burning in the boys' room, and that this was not a weakness that needed correcting. She knew that Ivy had nightmares sometimes and would come and stand in the kitchen doorway at 3 a.m, holding her wooden horse, and Evelyn had taken to leaving a small light on in the kitchen for exactly that purpose, and had twice now sat with the child at the kitchen table in the quiet of the winter night, warm under a blanket. not talking, just sitting, until Ivy's eyes went heavy again. Jonah noticed this. She wasn't sure how. She had been careful and quiet about it. But one morning he said simply, "She sleeps better than she did." And Evelyn said, "Good." And that was the whole of it. She noticed things about Jonah too. He worked harder than any person she had ever seen work, up before her most mornings, already in the barn by the time she had the coffee on, back inside only for meals and then gone again until the light failed entirely. He drove himself with a ferocity that was not ambition, she thought, but something else. The need to fill the hours with something physical, something that required all of his body so that his mind had to step aside. She recognized this also. She had done it herself, in the months after her own loss. She had not told him about that. She had not told him much about Boston at all. He hadn't asked, particularly. He was not a man who asked questions he hadn't decided yet to ask. He spoke when he had something to say and was quiet otherwise, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was just his nature. The particular cadence of a solitary person who had spent 7 winters in a place that required a kind of inwardness to survive. He was kind to his children in ways that were quiet and practical. The extra blanket left at the end of Ivy's bed without comment, the way he helped Luke with his reading without impatience even at the end of a long day. But he was also distant from them in a way that she wasn't sure he was fully aware of. He was there, present, doing the physical work of fathering, but the part of him that knew how to sit and be with them, she thought that part was still somewhere deep inside him, still standing at a distance, still grieving. She didn't say so. That was not her place yet, or perhaps it would never be. But she thought it. On the last day of the 3rd week, she was in the barn alone, spreading fresh straw in the horse stalls, and she found the photograph. It had fallen behind the old tack shelf. She wouldn't have found it at all if she hadn't been cleaning the shelf, which she had done because the winter mice were getting into the leather oil, and she was trying to figure out where they were coming from. The photograph was in a small frame, the kind kept in a pocket or on a mantelpiece. It showed a woman sitting in a chair, formally posed, the way they did photographs then. She was young, maybe 25, maybe less, with dark hair and a composed, direct gaze. She had Nora's mouth, Evelyn thought, and Mason's jaw. She held the photograph for a moment. The woman looked back at her from whatever particular day that had been, the day they'd dressed her up and sat her in that chair, a day she herself couldn't have imagined would be anything but ordinary. Evelyn thought about the particularity of that, how all the days that turn out to matter feel ordinary when you're living them. She put the photograph carefully on top of the tack shelf where it could be found. She didn't know if Jonah had lost it or put it there deliberately. She didn't ask. She just left it where it could be seen. That evening when she came in from the barn, Jonah was standing at the kitchen table. He had the photograph in his hand. He was just holding it, looking at it. He didn't hear her come in at first, and she saw him before he was aware of her, and she saw his face without the careful, composed surface it usually wore. Just for that brief moment, and what was there was simple and unguarded and very painful. Then he heard her and the surface came back. He put the photograph in his coat pocket. "Found it in the barn," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "Thank you." He went out the back door. She put the kettle on and didn't say anything else about it, and neither did he. Not then, not later. But something had shifted slightly, some small degree of acknowledgement, that she was there and had seen him and hadn't made anything of it. That had its own value. She thought he knew that. The 4th week brought the first real test. The temperature dropped on Monday to something that the coldest nights in Boston had never suggested was possible. Jonah told her it was 30 below, which she understood as a number without being able to feel it as a reality, except that every time she went outside, even for the few minutes it took to cross from the house to the barn, the cold hit her face like something deliberate, like a hand pressing. The inside of her nose froze, her eyelashes frosted. She learned to keep the wool scarf across her face and to move fast, and to keep moving. The children couldn't go out. Jonah kept the barn runs as short as possible. The horses were uneasy in the cold, stamping and blowing, and Evelyn learned to talk to them when she worked around them, low and steady, the way Jonah did, because it helped them settle. Mason came with her to the barn one morning when Jonah had gone to break the ice on the water trough and hadn't come back yet. There had been a problem with the pump, and the two of them worked in the barn together without talking much, just the necessary things. More hay here, check that latch, the gray mare needs her water topped off. At one point, Mason's breath came in a sharp sound that she recognized after a moment as a laugh. Not a happy sound, but a real one, because the old black gelding had very deliberately shoved its entire nose into Mason's hat and lifted it off his head. "He does that," Mason said, reclaiming the hat. "He seems proud of it," she said. "He's an idiot," Mason said, but the tightness around him was a little less than usual, just for that moment, and he scratched the gelding's nose with a familiarity that told her they had a long history together. "What's his name?" she asked. "Chester," Mason said. "Mama named him." A pause. She kept her hands busy with the water bucket. "She had a way with names," Mason said. He said it like he didn't mean to, like it had come out before he'd decided to say it. "Ivy's named after a plant Mama had in a window box in the house we lived in before we came here. Luke's named after her grandfather. Nora she liked the name Nora." "All good names," Evelyn said. "She named the horses too," he said. "Even Chester, which is a stupid name for a horse." "Is Chester a stupid name?" "It's a very stupid name," he said, with the first thing approaching actual humor she'd heard from him. She thought of 100 things she could have said. She chose silence instead, and just kept working. And after a moment, Mason kept working too, and the gelding watched them both from under his forelock with supreme equine indifference. On the way back to the house, in the cold and the white glare, Mason said, "You're different from the others." She waited. The others were, he looked for the word, trying too hard, trying to make it into something. "You're just working." "There's a lot of work to do," she said. "Yeah," he said. And then, "I haven't said anything to make you feel—" He stopped, started again. "I know I haven't been easy." "No," she said, honestly. "I'm not going to promise I'll be easy," he said. "I'm not asking you to be," she said. "Just fair, that's all I'd ask." He didn't say anything, but when they got to the house, he held the door open for her, and that was something. She lay awake that night and thought about what she'd come from, and what she'd come to, and what the difference was. Not the money or the work or the cold, though all of those were real. The difference was in the quality of the days. In Boston, the days had had a particular flatness, a repetition that led nowhere and promised nothing. Here the days were difficult and cold and exhausting and sometimes frightening in small ways, like the sound the wind made at 3 a.m, or the way the darkness of the landscape pressed right up against the house windows, absolute and indifferent. But the days meant something. They were building something, even if she didn't know yet exactly what. She thought about Jonah's face over the photograph. She thought about Ivy's nightmares and the small weight of the child's head against her arm at the kitchen table. She thought about Mason saying, "You're just working." The fire in the kitchen was still good. The house was warm. Outside, the wind was doing what it did at 30 below, which was everything it could to remind the small human things inside that it was in charge of this country and always had been. She pulled the blankets up and she thought, "I am not leaving." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't certainty about anything except the single fact of staying. But the single fact of staying, she thought, was enough to build on. It was what she had, and it was real, and she had learned to take the real things when they came and not hold out for perfect. Because perfect was a story you told yourself when you hadn't yet figured out what the actual options were. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the settling of the house, and the particular quiet of 4 children sleeping and one tired man somewhere above her in the dark. And she let herself, carefully and without making too much of it, be here. This, she thought, is a start. The single fact of staying. She had told herself that in the dark, and in the weeks that followed, she held on to it the way you hold on to something in a current. Not with grace, not with certainty, but with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that letting go is the worst option. January came down on the Cole Ranch like a judgment. The cold that had hit in the 4th week was, Jonah told her, not even the worst of it. The worst came in January, the deep cold that settled in and stayed. Not the dramatic cold of a sudden storm, but the grinding, relentless cold that simply was, day after day, so that the thermometer outside the kitchen door became a thing she tried not to look at directly. The wood consumption doubled. The horses needed checking twice as often. The water troughs froze overnight regardless of what you did. And every morning started with the same task of breaking ice, your breath coming in clouds, your fingers going numb inside your gloves inside 5 minutes. She had written to no one in Boston. There was no one particularly to write to. But if she had written, she thought she might have said, "It is nothing like I expected, and I am staying anyway." The children's schooling had become her responsibility by a kind of quiet default. There was no schoolhouse within reasonable distance in winter, and Jonah had no time for it, and the children had been doing a rough version of self-study with old primers and whatever Jonah could manage in the evenings. Evelyn had 2 years of schooling beyond what was common for a woman of her circumstances. A teacher in her neighborhood had taken an interest when she was young and pushed her further than the standard, and she put it to use now, setting up a couple of hours at the kitchen table each morning before the day's work took over. Nora was easy to teach. She absorbed things quietly and completely, and the only challenge was that she sometimes knew the answer before Evelyn had finished explaining the question, which was occasionally humbling. Luke was energetic and distracted and needed the work broken into small pieces and made interesting, which she learned to do by connecting whatever the subject was to something he'd seen or done that week. Arithmetic became counting fence posts and calculating feed weight. Geography became tracking the rivers they might need to cross in spring. Ivy sat at the table for the school hours even though she was too young for much of it, drawing pictures on whatever scrap paper Evelyn could spare, and occasionally asking questions that had nothing to do with the lesson and everything to do with being 5 years old and curious about the world. One morning, while Nora was doing long division and Luke was copying a map of the territory, Ivy said loudly, "Evelyn, what happened to your arm?" Everyone looked. Evelyn was pushing her sleeve back to reach across the table and the burn scar from the factory. Not the singes from the stove. Those had faded to nothing. The old scar from 2 years ago, a bad one she mostly forgot about, was visible above her wrist. "Work accident," she said, straightforward, pulling the sleeve back down. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore. It did for a while." Ivy considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old processing important information. "I have a scar on my knee," she said, "from when I fell on the porch steps." "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore," Ivy said, echoing the words back with complete seriousness. Then she went back to her drawing. Luke looked like he wanted to ask more. Nora gave him a look that was so purely Nora, patient, direct, a single raised brow, that he went back to his map. Evelyn looked at Nora, and Nora looked back at her with that grave, watchful expression, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile on either side, but was something in the neighborhood. It was in the second week of January that Mason stopped going to the barn. It happened gradually, not all at once. He'd always been the first one out in the mornings after Jonah, never one to linger inside. And then one morning he was at the table when she came down and he was still there an hour later, and she found Jonah had done the morning barn work alone. She didn't comment. The next morning, same thing. By the third day, Jonah's jaw had a particular set to it that she was learning to read. Not anger exactly, more like a man carrying something he doesn't know how to put down. She found Mason in the late afternoon of that third day, sitting at the small table in the back of the barn where the tack cleaning happened, doing nothing, just sitting with his hands flat on the table and looking at the middle distance. She had brought out the mending she needed to do, a practical excuse to be somewhere other than the house. And she sat down on the 3-legged stool near the door and started in on one of Luke's shirts and didn't say anything. The barn was cold but not bad, the animals providing their own warmth, and the gray light through the boards made everything look very still. After about 10 minutes, Mason said, "Her birthday was yesterday." Evelyn kept her needle moving. "Your mother's?" "January 12th. A long pause. "She would have been 34. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. He was 14. The mother had been 19 when he was born, which meant she had come to this territory and built this life and died at 32. That was 1 year older than Evelyn was now. "What was her name?" Evelyn asked. She'd never asked before. She knew she hadn't because she'd been aware of not asking, aware that the name was somewhere private in this household, spoken or not spoken, according to rules she didn't fully understand yet. Mason was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Clara." "That's a good name," she said. He looked at his hands. "Papa never talks about her. He thinks if he doesn't talk about her, we won't miss her as much." He said it without bitterness, just as a plain observation, but she heard what was underneath it. "Does he know that doesn't work?" she asked. "I don't know what he knows," Mason said. He sounded older than 14 saying it, and also younger, and that was the particular thing about grief at that age, she thought. It pulled in both directions at once. Missing someone doesn't go away because you stop saying their name, Evelyn said. You know that. Yeah, he said. Talking about them doesn't make it worse either, she said. Usually it's the other way. He was quiet again. Then, she used to say that the barn was the best place to think. Said you could hear yourself better out here than in the house. She was right about that, Evelyn said. A cow shifted in its stall. The wind moved outside and the boards creaked. Mason let out a long breath, slow and careful. I don't want to forget her, he said. It came out rough, the way things do when they've been held in too long. Then don't, Evelyn said. There's no rule that says you have to. He didn't say anything else. She finished the shirt and started on a tear in Nora's apron. And after a while the silence settled into something less tight, and when the light had gone enough that she couldn't see to sew, she packed up her mending and said she was going in to start supper. And Mason said, after a moment, I'll be in for supper. And the next morning he was up and out to the barn before she even had the fire built. She didn't tell Jonah about the conversation. It wasn't hers to tell. But that evening at the table, Jonah said to no one in particular, Claire used to make a bean soup with smoked pork that nobody else has ever come close to. He said it quietly, like he was looking at something far away, and the children went very still. And then Nora said, she put dried sage in it, and Luke said, an extra pepper. And Ivy said she didn't remember the soup, but she remembered a blue bowl, and everyone agreed that yes, Clara had a blue bowl she liked. Evelyn put the bread on the table and sat down and ate her supper and listened, and she did not try to be part of the memory. She just made space for it to happen. That was the right thing. She was fairly sure it was the right thing. February brought a thaw. Not a real one, nothing dramatic. The territory didn't offer that kindness. But a week where the temperature climbed back to just below freezing during the days, and the snow on the south-facing slopes softened, and the air had a smell to it that was different, something mineral and almost wet. The Jonah said meant winter was starting to think about loosening its grip. How long till real thaw? She asked. March, usually. Could be April. He glanced up at the sky. This year, hard to say. Is there something we should be doing to prepare? He looked at her when she said we. It was such a small thing. She noticed she'd said it and didn't take it back. Fencing needs checking before the ground softens, he said. Some of the barn roof needs attention before the snowmelt comes through, and the south pasture needs work before we can put the cattle back out there. Tell me what I can do, she said. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. Tell me anyway. He did. And she did it, imperfectly, learning as she went, with Mason and sometimes with Jonah and sometimes on her own. She learned to check a fence line properly, looking for the post that had heaved in the freeze and the wire that had gone slack. She learned the signs in the barn roof that meant trouble before the melt. She pulled her weight and then some, because she was stubborn and because the work was what she had now and she was not willing to be the thing that didn't carry its load. What she hadn't prepared for was the loneliness. Not the social loneliness of being new and unknown. She had always been able to manage that, had lived alone in the city long enough that solitude was familiar. This was different. This was the particular loneliness of the frontier, the understanding that miles and miles stretched between you and any other human life, that the nearest neighbor was 4 miles off, and that neighbor was an older man named Hatch, who came by rarely and mostly talked about feed prices, that the nearest town with anything in it was Bitter Creek, 9 miles northeast, which was itself not exactly a thriving hub. She had not thought she was the kind of person who needed community. She discovered she had been wrong about herself. It came on her in the long evenings of February, when the children were in bed and Jonah was doing the accounts or reading the few pages of newspaper that came through when the mail rider made it out, and the silence was just the silence of the house and the land and the cold outside. She would sit with her mending or her own reading. She had found 3 novels in the chest in the front room, left by God knew who, and she rationed them carefully. And she would feel the weight of the distance around her in a way that was almost physical. She didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say. The loneliness was not something anyone could fix. It was just a condition of the place, like the cold, like the dark. You endured it or you left, and she had already decided she was not leaving. But one night, in the 3rd week of February, she was sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else was in bed, reading by lamplight, and she became suddenly and completely aware of how far she was from anything she had ever known, The pages of the novel stopped making sense. The words were just marks. She sat there with the lamp and the cold and the dark and the miles, and she thought, in the flat, honest way that comes to you at 2 in the morning, what have you done? The kitchen door opened. She startled. Jonas stood in the doorway in his work clothes. She could see from the way he was dressed that he'd never quite gone to bed. With a coffee cup in his hand and the expression of a man who'd found something unexpected but wasn't going to make a production of it. Couldn't sleep, he said. No, she agreed. He came in and put the kettle on without asking if she wanted anything, and she watched him move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and she thought about how little she knew about him, and how much she'd been learning, and what a strange and particular thing it was to be here, in this kitchen, in this life, with this man she'd known for 6 weeks. He sat down across the table from her with 2 cups of coffee, and she took one, and they sat in the quiet. The lamp cast its small circle. Outside, the wind had died down, and the night was very still. You have nights like this, she said. Not a question. Since she died, yes, he said. Not as many as there used to be. She wrapped her hands around the cup. How long does that take, getting fewer? He thought about it seriously the way he considered most things. A year before I stopped waking up and expecting her to be there, he said. Another year before the anger went out of it. Anger? At everything, he said. At myself for not... He stopped, started again. Fever comes fast in winter. Sometimes there's nothing to do. I know that. He looked at his cup. Knowing it didn't help with the anger. She thought about the factory scar on her arm. About the particular anger that comes from being unable to protect yourself from something. How it had nowhere to go, so it just stayed, lodged somewhere inside, and you carried it. What did help? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. The work, he said. The kids needing things, and a pause. Time, just time, which is a terrible answer, but it's the only one that's true. It's not terrible, she said. They sat. The coffee was good. She'd learned his ratio, not the watery stuff she'd made the first week. And the kitchen was warm, and the stillness outside was not the same as the pressing loneliness of an hour ago. She noticed that. You're managing well, he said. Better than you think you are. She looked up. He was looking at her directly, the way he sometimes did with that straightforward quality that had no performance in it. You've had easier winters, she said. I've had worse help, he said. And I've had help that was technically more prepared and worth a fraction of what you're doing. A pause. The children... He stopped. Ivy hasn't had a nightmare in 2 weeks. I know, she said. Mason went back to the barn, he said. I know that too. He nodded slowly, looking at his cup. I'm not good at saying things like this, he said. I want you to know that. It's not that I don't notice. I know you notice, she said. He looked at her again, and she looked back. And there was a moment that lasted a fraction of a second too long to be nothing, and then he looked down at his coffee, and she looked at hers, and neither of them said anything about it because neither of them was ready, and maybe would not be for a long time yet. And that was fine. That was honest. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. I will in a while, he said. She picked up her book and her coffee and went to her room, and she lay on the cot and listened to the sounds of him moving around the kitchen for another 20 minutes before it went quiet, and the stillness that settled after that was different from the loneliness of 2 hours ago, and she thought about that for a while before she finally slept. The thaw that February promised kept being delayed, but something else thawed slowly, the way things do in that country, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way ice goes in a slow-moving river, breaking at the edges first, then pulling back from the banks, then finally, when enough has happened, releasing its hold on the middle. Mason helped her carry firewood without being asked one morning. Not a lot, just the stack from the porch to the box by the stove, which he'd been leaving to her since she arrived. He did it without comment, and she didn't make any, and he went back to his own work, and that was it. But she noticed. Nora started correcting her bread technique. This was offered as fact, not criticism. Just, Mama pressed the heel of her hand harder at this part. And Evelyn let herself be corrected, which seemed to surprise Nora. And after that, Nora corrected her on 2 or 3 other household things. Not often, but when it mattered. And each time Evelyn listened and adjusted, and the bread did get better. Luke taught her the names of every horse in the barn and quizzed her on them randomly throughout the day, pointing at whichever animal they happened to be near and waiting with enormous patience while she came up with the name. She got it wrong twice, calling Chester by the name of a roan mare called Duchess. And Luke's delighted laugh at this, full and uncomplicated, a child's real laugh, was the best sound she had heard since arriving. And Ivy, one morning in the last week of February, came downstairs to the kitchen while Evelyn was starting the bread and stood watching her for a while in that particular 5-year-old way, where the watching is completely visible and unembarrassed, and then said, "Evelyn, can I stay in here with you?" "Of course," she said. "I'm not going to help," Ivy said clearly. "I'm just going to be here." "That's all right," Evelyn said. "You can just be here." And so Ivy climbed onto the chair at the corner of the table and arranged her wooden horse and her small self and stayed there all morning, mostly quiet, occasionally asking something about what Evelyn was doing or why the dough looked different from yesterday or whether Chester would eat biscuits. It was comfortable in the way only small children can make things comfortable, without trying, without performance, just with the simple warmth of their presence. That afternoon when Jonah came in for the midday meal and found Ivy still planted in her kitchen chair and Evelyn working around her with the ease of someone who'd stopped noticing an obstacle and started accepting a fixture, he stood in the doorway for a moment. His expression, when she happened to look up, was something she couldn't quite name. She went back to the stove. He sat down at the table. The meal was the usual kind. Nothing special, just what there was and what she could do with it. And they ate, all 5 of them in the warm kitchen, and the wind pushed at the windows and the cold pressed at the walls, and inside the lamp gave its yellow light, and the stove gave its warmth, and it was ordinary and difficult and impermanent and real. That night, lying on her cot in the small room off the kitchen, she thought about the scar on her arm, and the burn from the factory, and the city, and the 17 cents she'd arrived with, and she thought about what it had taken to get here, and what staying was costing her, and what it was giving her in return, and she thought, not enough yet. Not enough of the giving, but something. Something that mattered in a way the days in Boston had stopped mattering a long time ago. She turned over and closed her eyes, and outside the last of February's cold was settling into the bones of the night. And inside, in the small room off the kitchen, she slept without dreaming, and that, in its own way, was enough. March came in the way it sometimes does in that country, not with any real softening, but with a kind of restlessness, the sky changing its mind every few hours. Snow one morning and a thin pale sun by afternoon, and then clouds piling back up from the northwest by evening. The land felt unsettled. The animals felt it too. The horses were nervy in the mornings, wanting to move, and the cattle out in the south pasture had been pressing the fence line in a way that meant something. Though Evelyn didn't yet have enough experience to read exactly what, Jonah read it. He'd been reading the land and the animals and the sky for 7 years in this particular territory, and he had the quiet certainty of someone who has learned a thing the hard way and knows they've learned it. He said, one morning in the 2nd week of March, while they were both looking at the cloud bank building to the northwest, "There's a storm in that." "Today?" she asked. "Tonight," he said. "Maybe tomorrow morning. Hard to say how bad." He wasn't wrong about that either. The storm came in around 9 that evening, announced first by a drop in temperature that was sudden enough to feel deliberate, and then by the wind, which went from the ordinary cold wind of a March night to something with a different quality entirely. Not just cold, but driving, with ice crystals in it that hit the skin like small cuts. Evelyn had just finished putting Ivy to bed when she heard the first real gust hit the north wall of the house, and the sound it made was nothing like the wind she knew from February. This was lower, more forceful. It had weight. She came back to the kitchen and found Jonah already pulling on his heaviest coat, a lantern in his hand. "Barn," he said. "I'll come," she said. He looked at her. She was already reaching for her own coat. He didn't argue. They went out into it together, and the cold that hit her was so complete she gasped before she could stop herself. The air pulled the breath right out of her lungs and replaced it with something that felt like swallowing ice. She got the scarf up over her face and bent her head and followed the line of the rope Jonah had strung between the house and the barn months ago exactly for this purpose. She hadn't understood the rope when she first saw it. She understood it now. The barn was loud with the animals' unease. The horses were moving, shifting, the whites of their eyes showing. Chester had his head up and was turning in his stall. The cattle in the attached section were pressing together. Jonah went to the horses first, moving among them with the low voice that settled them, his hands on necks and flanks, and she followed his lead, doing what he did. Just being present, moving slow, talking low. She didn't know enough to know whether she was helping, but she knew enough to know that panicked animals in a storm were a serious problem and that calm humans made calmer animals. They stayed in the barn for the better part of an hour, long enough for the horses to stop showing their whites, and for Chester to demonstrate his feelings about the situation by stealing Jonah's glove off the post where he'd left it, which Jonah noticed with the particular expression of a man who has had this specific glove stolen by this specific horse before. "He does that when he's anxious," Jonah said. "He did it to Mason's hat," Evelyn said, working to get the glove back while Chester regarded her with enormous equine smugness. "Maybe it helps him." "Helps him," Jonah said, deadpan. "He's going to lose me a hand to frostbite." She got the glove. Chester gave it up with no grace whatsoever. By the time they made the rope walk back to the house, the storm had come fully in. The wind was horizontal, and the snow it was carrying made seeing more than a few feet impossible. She felt the cold through every layer she had on, and when she came through the kitchen door and the warmth hit her face, the contrast was so severe she had to stand still for a moment and just breathe. Jonah was checking the fire. She pulled off her outer layers and hung them to dry, and then went to check on the children. Ivy was still asleep somehow, the resilience of the very young. Luke was awake, sitting up in his bed with the listening expression of a child monitoring a situation. Nora was at the window of the room she shared with Ivy, looking out at nothing, since there was nothing visible. "Is it bad?" Nora said, without turning from the window. "Bad enough," Evelyn said. "The animals are settled. Your father checked everything." "Mama used to sit up in bad storms," Nora said. "She said sleeping through it felt wrong." "I think I understand that," Evelyn said. She went back down to the kitchen. Jonah was still there, sitting at the table with his coffee. Not going to bed, because of course he wasn't. The storm made sleep impractical, or at least that was the practical reason. She put the kettle on and sat down across from him, and they sat in the sounds of the storm, the wind working at the house, the occasional crack from the direction of the trees, the uneven light from the lamp moving slightly whenever a big gust hit. "Has the house ever come through bad without much damage?" she asked. "So far," he said. "Barn had a section of roof go in the second winter. Before that, I'd reinforced the wrong section." He paused. "I knew better after that." "You rebuilt it yourself?" Mason helped. He was 7. Something moved in his face. He was good at it. Clara said he was going to be a builder. He's got that mind, the one that sees how things fit together. She looked at her cup. "He's been better," she said carefully. "This past month." "I know," Jonah said. "I noticed." He didn't say more than that, but she understood it was acknowledgement, the same way him sitting across from her at 2 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee was acknowledgement. He had a whole language made of small practical things. They stayed up until the worst of it passed, around 3 a.m. She was barely awake by then, her eyes gritty, her head full of the particular cotton wool of deep tiredness. And when Jonah said, "I think it's past the worst," she nodded and pushed herself up from the table and went to her cot and was asleep before she'd finished thinking about being asleep. The morning after the storm was the kind of morning that felt like an apology from the sky. The air was still and the sun came up sharp, and the snow that had piled against everything overnight caught the light and threw it back in a way that was almost painful to look at. Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment with her coffee before the day's work started, and the world was white and still, and the mountains to the north were absolutely clear, every ridge and fold visible like something drawn. Mason came and stood beside her. He had his hat pulled down and his coat, the one she'd mended, the cuffs still holding, buttoned to the throat. "Storm dropped close to 2 feet, he said. "It looked like more," she said. "Always does." He drank his own coffee. "Need to check the south pasture fence today. Storm like that shifts things." "I'll come," she said. He looked at her briefly, the same way Jonah sometimes looked at her. The fractional pause when she offered to help with something he hadn't expected her to offer for. Then, "All right," he said. The south pasture fence had held better than expected. Only 2 posts shifted and one section of wire down where a tree branch had come across it. Mason fixed the posts while she held them, the ground still giving slightly in the upper layer despite the cold. And when it came to restringing the wire, he showed her how to use the fence tool without making a lesson of it, just doing it and talking through what he was doing in a natural way. And she learned it. They were on their way back across the pasture when Mason stopped. She nearly ran into him. He was completely still, looking toward the tree line at the west edge of the pasture, maybe 150 yards out. She looked where he was looking and saw nothing at first, just the snow and the bare trees, and then she saw what he was seeing, tracks, a line of them, coming out of the trees, crossing the pasture at an angle, disappearing back into the trees on the south side. "Mountain lion?" she said. "No," Mason said. "Too big, too far apart." He studied the line of tracks for another moment. "Man," he said. She looked again. He was right. Now that he'd said it, she could see it, the shape of boot prints in the snow, a single line of them, purposeful, not wandering. "Someone crossing the property?" she said. "Maybe," he said. He didn't sound convinced. "Is that usual? People cutting through?" "Sometimes in summer, people moving stock." He was still looking at the tracks. "Not in March. Not after a storm like last night. Nobody's traveling for no reason." She looked at the line of prints coming from the west, disappearing south. "Should we tell your father?" "Yeah," Mason said. "We should tell him." Jonah looked at the tracks that afternoon, the 2 of them and Mason walking the line. He didn't say much while he was reading them. He crouched down near the clearest set and looked at them for a long time. "Deliberate," he said finally. "That's what I thought," Mason said. "Skirting the pasture, staying near the tree line." He straightened up. "Not a man cutting through. A man looking at something." "The ranch?" Evelyn said. Jonah looked at her. "Maybe," he said, the same flat word Mason had used. She was starting to understand it as a word these two used when they meant probably, but weren't ready to say so. "I'll talk to Hatch," Jonah said. "See if he's seen anything." Hatch, the neighbor 4 miles off, knew things. This Evelyn had already gathered. The old man was the kind of fixture who noticed everything and talked to enough people that information moved through him the way water moves through gravel, picking up whatever was in the soil. Jonah rode out to Hatch's place the next afternoon and came back with a look on his face that she had not seen before. She waited until the children were in bed and she and Jonah were at the kitchen table with the remains of supper still between them. "What did Hatch say?" she asked. Jonah was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "He said there's been a man asking around Bitter Creek in the last week, asking about this ranch, about who lives here." Her hands went still on the table. "He didn't learn the man's name," Jonah said. "But Hatch said he was well-dressed. Not from here. He said the man had a particular way of asking things, like he already knew the answers and was just checking." The quality of the silence in the kitchen changed. "What did you tell Hatch?" she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. "That I didn't know who that might be," Jonah said. He looked at her directly. "I don't know who it might be, but I thought you might." She had known, somewhere under the surface of the last 3 months, that this was possible. She had not let herself look at it directly. She had kept her attention on the work, on the children, on the daily business of surviving this place and building something here. And she had not thought about Boston, had not thought about what she'd left and what might follow. She looked at the tabletop. "His name is Victor Langford," she said. Jonah was very still. "He's a businessman in Boston, has interests in many things. Properties, investments, import trade." She paused. "I worked in one of his textile operations 3 years ago." Another pause. "He takes an interest in certain women who work for him, the kind of interest that's not offered as a choice." Jonah said nothing. His face had gone to something she couldn't read, controlled and flat. "I left Boston because of him," she said. "Not immediately after. It took me longer than it should have to leave. But eventually." She looked up. "I didn't think he would follow this far." "Why would he?" Jonah said. His voice was very quiet. "Because he considers—" She stopped. Tried again. "Men like Victor Langford don't accept that something they consider theirs has been taken from them. That's how they think. Not, it isn't about caring. It's about the fact of it. The thing itself. You're not a thing, Jonah said. He said it flat and plain, with no decoration, and something in her chest did something complicated. I know that, she said. He doesn't. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. How dangerous is he? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way to think about it. Dangerous in the way that men with money are dangerous, she said. He doesn't do things himself. He has people who do things, and he knows people, lawyers, officials. He can make things difficult through legitimate means. Arson isn't a legitimate mean, Jonah said. She looked at him. No, she said. That's not his usual way. She stopped. If he sent someone here to look at the ranch, that's about information. But arson is a message, Jonah said. She felt it then, the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Has there been any? Nothing yet, he said. But I want you to hear me. He waited until she looked at him. This is your home. Whatever this man thinks, this is your home, and you have every right to be here, and I will not allow... He stopped. His jaw worked. I am not a man who allows things like this to stand. You understand me? She understood him. She also understood that a rancher in Montana with 4 children and a hard winter behind him was not, in the ordinary scheme of things, equipped to stand against a wealthy Boston businessman with connections and resources and the particular bottomless spite of a man who considered himself owed. She didn't say that. What she said was, "Thank you." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else, and they sat in the kitchen until the lamp oil got low, and then they went to their separate rooms, and she lay on her cot and thought about Victor Langford in a way she had not let herself think about him in months, turning him over in her mind like a thing she needed to look at clearly. The fire came on a Friday, 12 days after Jonah had spoken to Hatch. She was in the house. In the late afternoon, mending in the kitchen while Nora read and Ivy slept, and Luke was at the table with his arithmetic. Jonah was out checking the east fence. Mason was in the barn. She heard Mason shout before she saw anything. It was not a word. It was the particular sound of alarm without language, pure volume and urgency, and she was moving before she'd decided to move. She came out the back door and stopped. The barn was on fire. Not the whole thing yet. The east wall, the back section, where the hay was stored. The hay that was still substantial in March, the hay that was the driest and most flammable thing on the property, was fully involved, flames moving up the wall in the way fire moves when it has found exactly what it wants, fast and confident and utterly indifferent to what's in its way. And Mason was going back inside. She heard herself say his name in a way she hadn't heard her own voice before, sharp and high. And then she was running across the yard because she could see what he was going in for. The horses, Chester, and the others, she could hear them screaming, and the sound of a horse screaming is not a sound you can hear and stand still. She went in through the front barn doors, which were not yet involved. The smoke inside was not yet thick enough to be blinding, but it was bad, and the heat was already coming off the east wall in waves. Mason had Chester's stall open and was trying to get a rope on the gelding, but Chester was beyond reason, eyes white and wild, hooves crashing. She grabbed the other lead rope off the hook and went to the next stall, the gray mare, and got the door open. "Get them out!" Mason shouted over the noise of everything. "I know," she shouted back. The gray was terrified, but less violent than Chester. She got the rope over the mare's neck and pulled, and the mare fought her for a moment, and then some survival instinct overrode the panic, and she came, lurching, stumbling, and Evelyn pulled her through the front doors and got 3 steps out into the yard before the mare broke free and ran for the far fence, which was fine, let her run. She went back in, smoke thicker now. She could feel it in her lungs. The east wall made a sound that was not quite a crack, and not quite a groan, something between. And she did not let herself look at it because looking at it would mean thinking about it, and she didn't have time. She got the second stall open, the roan gelding, got the rope on him faster because her hands had figured out the mechanics now, pulled him through. He went willingly. They all went willingly once they could smell the outside air. Mason was still fighting with Chester. She came back in the third time, and the smoke was wrong, too low. She had to duck to breathe clean air, and the east wall had gone from alarming to critical, the beams showing through the flames, the roof of that section starting to move in a way structural things should not move. She saw Mason had given up on the rope and was trying to blindfold Chester with his jacket, covering the horse's eyes so he couldn't see the fire. It was working, barely. Chester was still moving, but less wildly. She grabbed the halter when he brought Chester's head around, and the three of them moved, Mason on one side and her on the other, and the enormous terrified horse between them, through the front doors, into the yard, and 10 steps later the roof section of the east wall came down. The sound it made was like the world rearranging itself. They stood in the yard with the horse between them and watched the east section collapse inward, and the fire bloomed up and out with the collapse, sending a column of sparks into the March air, and Chester screamed once more and then went still, shaking, his sides heaving, Evelyn's hand still on his halter. Mason was breathing hard. She could hear it even over the fire. His jacket was in his hand, scorched along one edge. His face had a streak of ash across it, and his eyes, when he turned to look at her, were very dark and very young, and for a second, just a second, showed everything, the fear that had been underneath the action, the full weight of what had almost happened. "You went back in," he said, 3 times. "So did you," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. "I know." And because there was nothing else that needed saying, and because the fire was still burning and the horses were still scattered across the far end of the property, she said, "Help me get Chester to the fence." They got the horses gathered. Jonah came back from the east fence at a hard run, having seen the smoke from a mile off, and the look on his face when he came into the yard and saw the barn, or what was left of it, and the horses scattered but intact, and Evelyn and Mason standing together in the smoke-heavy air, that look she would not try to describe. He crossed the yard and put his hand on Mason's shoulder, and then his hand on Evelyn's arm, just briefly, just for a second, checking that they were real and solid and standing, and then he turned to the fire and started assessing. A third of the barn was gone. The hay, the east equipment storage, the corner stall. The structural damage to the remaining 2/3 was bad but not fatal. The main supports had held. They could work with what remained. They would have to. The animals were all accounted for. 3 horses recovered and now standing at the fence in a loose group, still nervous. The cattle had been in the south pasture, far enough off to have been spared the worst of the panic. The barn cats, who Evelyn had been only dimly aware of as a vague presence in the hay, 3 of them, she'd counted once, were nowhere visible, and then one appeared on top of the water trough and regarded the smoldering east wall with an expression of pure feline judgment. Luke came out of the house at some point and stood very still in the yard. Nora came out and stood next to him and did not move. "Is everyone all right?" Nora said. "Everyone's all right," Evelyn said. "What happened?" "Fire started in the hay," Jonah said. He said it like a fact, which it was. He did not say the rest of what he clearly was thinking, that hay stored in March in a cold barn does not start on its own, that fires that start in the hay wall of a barn on a clear afternoon, with no lamp left burning and no horse that could have kicked a lantern over, do not start by accident. That night, after the children were in bed, and the embers of the east section had finally gone cold enough to leave without watching, Jonah and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table again. He had the smell of smoke in his coat. She could smell it on herself. "Hatch saw a man leave town heading northeast day before yesterday," Jonah said. "I talked to him this afternoon while you were cleaning up." "Northeast," she said, "toward here." "There's nothing else northeast," he said. "Can you prove anything?" "Not yet," he said. "I'm going into Bitter Creek tomorrow morning to talk to the sheriff. Whatever Langford is doing, he's not doing it legally." He looked at her steadily. "I need to know anything else you can tell me about him, how he operates, who he uses, whether he's done things like this before." She thought about Boston. She thought about things she had not thought about in months. She thought about a woman she had known, another worker from Langford's textile operation, who had caused trouble for him by talking to the wrong people, and what had happened to the woman's lodgings 2 weeks later. Fire, then, too. Official cause? Negligence. "There was another time," she said. "A woman named— it doesn't matter, she crossed him. He had someone burn her out." She paused. It was ruled accidental. Jonah's expression was controlled and very still. "He's done this before and gotten away with it," he said. "He has money enough to make things come out the way he wants," she said. "That's how it works." "Not here," Jonah said. "This isn't Boston." She wanted to believe him. She did believe him partly. She believed in Jonah's particular hardness, the specific character of a man who had spent 7 years in this territory and built something in it and was not going to be moved. But she also believed in Victor Langford's money and his patience and his complete absence of conscience in pursuing what he considered his. "I'm sorry," she said, "for bringing this here." "You didn't bring it," he said, sharp and clear. "He brought it. There's a difference, and I want you to be very clear on that." She looked at him. "You came here with nothing," he said. "You came here and you have worked every day, and you have, my children—" He stopped, tried again. "You didn't bring anything here except yourself, and that has been good. The rest of this is his doing, and I won't have you sitting here carrying it like it's yours." She sat with that for a moment. It was the longest thing she had heard him say about anything that wasn't practical. "All right," she said. Outside, the March wind was doing what March winds did. Not the violence of the blizzard, but the steady, purposeful cold of a territory reminding you it was still in charge. Inside, the lamp was burning low. The house was quiet above them, the children sleeping in their beds. The east wall of the barn was a skeleton of charred beams against the dark. Tomorrow there would be work to do, and the day after, and the days after that. She was not going to stop being afraid. She knew Victor Langford well enough to know that what had happened was not an end, but a signal, a first move, a demonstration of reach. He wanted her to know he could find her anywhere. She also knew something she had not known 3 months ago, something she was still learning the edges of, that she was not, anymore, standing in it alone. Mason had gone back into a burning barn for the horses. She had gone back in after him. They had done that together without discussion, without decision. They had just done it, and it had worked, and the horses were standing at the fence, and everyone was accounted for, and the fire had taken what it took and left the rest. She thought about that, the way it had happened, the way some things, when they go badly enough, end up showing you something you couldn't have seen otherwise. She went to bed eventually, in the small room off the kitchen, and she lay on the cot and thought about Victor Langford somewhere out there, in whatever comfort he'd arranged for himself, satisfied perhaps with what his man had done, thinking perhaps that she was frightened enough now to come back, thinking perhaps that she was alone out here and had been reminded of it. He was wrong about the alone part. She had known it before the fire, in a tentative and still-forming way. She knew it more solidly now, the way you know things that have been tested. She closed her eyes. The wind moved outside. The house settled. Somewhere above her, in the boys' room, she could hear the faint sound of Luke's breathing, even and slow, a child asleep without worry, which meant that in the morning she would need to make sure he stayed that way, not by pretending nothing had happened, but by being steadily present, by being the thing that didn't leave. She was going to be that thing. She had decided. Jonah left for Bitter Creek before dawn the next morning. Evelyn heard him go. The particular sounds of a man moving carefully in the dark so as not to wake the house, the creak of the porch step, the low noise of the horse being brought out of what remained of the functional barn section. She lay on her cot and listened to the sounds fade out across the yard, and then it was just the house, and the dark, and the pre-dawn quiet of the territory, and she got up and built the fire and put the coffee on and started the day. She did not tell the children everything. She told them enough, that the fire was being looked into, that their father had gone to speak with the sheriff in Bitter Creek, that there was work to do on the barn, and they would all be doing it. Luke asked if someone had started the fire on purpose, and she said they didn't know yet, which was technically true, and also the version of true that would let him sleep. Nora looked at her across the table with that level, reading gaze, and Evelyn looked back and gave a small nod, barely visible, and Nora understood that there was more that wasn't being said and accepted it without pushing. That was Nora. Mason said nothing during breakfast. He ate quickly and went out to assess the barn damage in the early light. And when Evelyn came out an hour later, she found him already pulling the worst of the charred material away from the structural supports, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who has turned his feelings into physical task. She understood that impulse entirely. She picked up the other work gloves hanging on the porch nail and went to help him. They worked through the morning without talking much. Occasionally, Mason would say something practical. "This beam can stay. That one needs to come out. We need to replace the east wall boarding before the next rain." And she would respond practically, and the work went forward. By midday, they had cleared most of the debris from the collapsed section and had a reasonable picture of what the repair would require. Mason straightened up, pulling his hat back and looking at the exposed framing. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8 if we can't get materials from town fast. Your father will figure out the materials, she said. Mason looked at the gap in the barn wall where the east section had been. The morning light came through it at a flat angle, and you could see the territory through it, the snow-covered land, the tree line at the west pasture edge. He stood looking at it for a moment with his jaw set and his hands at his sides. He's coming here, isn't he? Mason said. This man from Boston. She didn't insult him by pretending she didn't know what he meant. I think so, she said. Eventually. Why? He turned and looked at her directly. The adult directness he sometimes showed that was still disconcerting on a 14-year-old's face. What does he want from you? She thought about how to answer that honestly without saying things that were not appropriate for a 14-year-old to carry. She settled on, he's the kind of man who doesn't accept that people can leave, that they can make their own choices about their own lives. He thinks because he has money and connections he has, authority, over situations, over people. Mason considered this. That's a foolish way to think, he said. Yes, she said, but he's been able to make it work for a long time, which makes him harder to deal with than a fool who hasn't. He was quiet for another moment. Then, what did he do to you? She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily, not with prying curiosity, but with the particular steadiness of someone asking a thing they feel they have a right to know, and perhaps he did, in the way that people who live in the same place and face the same threats have a right to understand what those threats are. Enough, she said. He did enough that leaving was the only real option, and enough that I should have left sooner than I did. She paused. That's what I'll say about it. He held her gaze for another second, and then nodded, once, with a gravity that was entirely his father's. All right, he said, and went back to work. Jonah came back from Bitter Creek in the late afternoon. She knew from the way he came into the yard, not hurried, but with a purposefulness that wasn't his usual end-of-day gait, that he had both news and a plan, and she waited until he'd seen to the horse and come into the kitchen before she asked. He sat down at the table, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Sheriff's name is Doyle, he said. Ben Doyle. He's been here 8 years. He's not a fool, and he's not in anyone's pocket, which matters. A pause. I told him everything. About the tracks, about the fire, about Langford. What did he say? He said he'd need evidence before he could do anything legally, which I expected. Jonah's expression was controlled. But he also said he's had a man answering Langford's description staying at the Bitter Creek boarding house for 4 days. Came in 2 days before the fire. She felt it, the tightening in her chest that happened whenever Langford became specific and close instead of theoretical and distant. He's still there, she said. Doyle thinks so. The man hasn't checked out. Jonah looked at his cup. He also said the man's been asking around about property records. Who owns what land out here? How long they've held it? Whether there are any disputes on file. That's how he works, she said. He doesn't just come at something directly. He looks for openings, legal vulnerabilities, things he can use. Is there anything he can use here? Jonah asked. He asked it without defensiveness, just as a practical question. On the property, the land title? I don't know your situation, she said carefully. The title's clean, he said. Filed in 68, renewed in 73, no disputes on record. A pause. But I filed the original paperwork through a land agent in Helena, who I later learned had some practices that weren't strictly legal. He's dead now, the agent. Died 2 winters ago. He looked at her steadily. I don't know if there's anything in those original filings that someone with enough lawyers and enough money could make trouble with. She understood what he was telling her. He wouldn't need the trouble to be real, she said. He just needs it to be expensive and time-consuming and stressful enough that... She stopped. That I'd want it gone, Jonah said, and he'd offer to make it go away in exchange for... He stopped too. Yes, she said. That's how he thinks. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face and saw the anger in it. Not the hot kind, but the settled, banked kind that in her experience was harder to deal with because it didn't burn out. He's not getting what he came for, Jonah said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without flourish, as a statement of fact rather than a declaration. I want to be clear on that. Jonah, she said, he has resources that— I know what he has, he said. I also know what I have. He looked at her. Doyle is writing to the Federal Land Office in Helena to get certified copies of all the filings on this property, original and subsequent, so that whatever Langford or his lawyers try to claim, we have the clean record in hand. He paused. He's also sending a wire to a contact in Boston, a federal marshal he knows, to see if Langford has any outstanding issues on his record there. She looked up. Does Doyle think he might? A man who does what Langford apparently does doesn't only do it once, Jonah said. Doyle said that, and I think he's right. She thought about the woman whose lodgings had burned. She thought about 2 or 3 other things she knew from her years in Boston, things she had buried and not thought about, things that had seemed at the time like just the way the world worked for people who didn't have power. They didn't have to stay buried. There may be things I could tell the marshal, she said slowly. Things I know directly, things I witnessed. And a woman I knew, her name was Ruth Carey. If she's still in Boston, if she'd be willing to talk— She stopped. I don't know if she would. He frightened her badly. Would she talk to a federal marshal? Jonah said. I don't know, she said honestly. But she might. He nodded. Doyle's going to need everything you're willing to give him, in writing, if you can. The more specific, the better. She thought about writing it down, about putting the specific and particular facts of what Victor Langford had done onto paper where they could be read by official eyes and entered into official record. There was something in the thought that made her want to look away, and something else in it that was the opposite of that. A release, almost, like setting something down you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. I'll write it, she said. She spent the next 2 evenings at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, writing in the careful, precise hand she'd learned from that teacher long ago. She wrote factually, without embellishment, without the particular pain of it in the language because she didn't need the pain in it. She just needed the facts. And the facts were enough. What he had done. When. What she had witnessed him do to others. The names she knew. The incident with Ruth Carey's lodgings. What she had been told and by whom, specific and dated as best she could remember. She filled 6 pages. Jonah read them when she was done. He sat at the table and read them without any change in his expression. And when he finished, he set them down carefully and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll take these to Doyle tomorrow. There's one more thing, she said. She had been thinking about it since their first conversation, turning it over. The Christmas gathering, the settlement families do it every year, you said. Is that still happening? He looked at her. Planned for the 23rd, he said. Hatch's place. Why? Because Langford will want a confrontation on his own terms, she said. He'll want to come here, to this ranch, privately, where there are no witnesses, and where he can present whatever he's prepared as though he has authority. He's done it before. He finds people when they're isolated. She paused. He won't like doing it publicly. He won't like witnesses. He especially won't like witnesses who are established members of this community and who know us. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. You want to draw him out? I want him somewhere he can't control the situation, she said. If Doyle can be there, if the federal record is in hand by then, if he tries to make his claim in front of people who know the truth about this land and this family— She stopped. It won't be neat, but it might be the place where he runs out of room. Jonah was quiet. She could see him turning it over, the way he thought about things, carefully and without rushing. It's a risk, he said. Yes, she said. He could make a scene that goes badly. He could, she said, or he could be the one exposed instead of us. He looked at her steadily. You've thought about this man a long time, he said. I've been afraid of him a long time, she said, which was different and more honest. But I'm not only afraid of him. Not anymore. Something shifted in Jonah's face. All right, he said, the gathering stands. The weeks between this fire and Christmas were not calm. The barn repair moved forward in the cold, Mason directing much of it with that builder's mind his mother had apparently recognized early, and 2 of the neighboring ranchers came by with timber and labor, because that was the way of things out here. The old mutual necessity that didn't require asking. Hatch came with his son-in-law, and they worked 2 full days on the east framing without being invited. Just arrived with tools and got to work. And Evelyn fed them lunch and did not make a speech about gratitude because she understood that in this territory, speeches about gratitude were not the currency. Work was. Doyle sent word through Hatch in the first week of December. His contact in Boston had confirmed that there were 2 civil complaints against Victor Langford that had been settled quietly, both involving women from his business operations, both settled with money and non-disclosure. Nothing criminal on record, but the federal marshal in Boston, a man named Garrett, was interested in the arson angle, interested enough to request Evelyn's written account through official channels, which Doyle submitted on her behalf. She did not know if it would be enough. She was learning to live with not knowing. What she knew was the ranch and the children and the days, which had their own momentum now, regardless of what was building at the edges. Ivy had started calling her Evelyn Mama. One word, run together, as though the hyphen was just how the name was spelled. She had done it for the first time without warning one morning at the breakfast table, asking for more porridge. And no one had commented on it, not the other children, not Jonah, just as though it was a natural thing, which perhaps it was. Nora had started teaching Evelyn the quilt patterns Clara had used. She didn't frame it that way. She just appeared one afternoon with the old quilt from the front room chest and began explaining, matter-of-factly, which patterns were which and how the pieces were cut. Evelyn listened and learned, and when she made mistakes, Nora corrected her with Clara's precision and Clara's lack of impatience, and the quilt became a place where something was being passed along, though neither of them named it. Luke told her one evening, with the earnest simplicity of an 8-year-old who has given something serious thought, "I think you should stay forever." He said it like a proposal, like he'd worked out the logic and arrived at a conclusion and was presenting it. She looked at him across the table. "I'm planning on it," she said. He nodded seriously and went back to his reading, apparently satisfied. Mason was harder to read, as always, but the hostility, the particular not seeing that had characterized those first weeks, was gone. What had replaced it was something more complicated and in some ways more affecting, a tentative, still-forming version of trust, offered in small, specific actions rather than in words. He told her things about the ranch, about the land, about the history of the place, not as conversation particularly, but as briefing, as though he had decided she needed this information and was making sure she had it. He asked her once if she knew how to shoot, and when she said no, he took her out to the east fence line on a clear afternoon and spent an hour showing her how to handle the rifle he'd been using since he was 10, not impatiently, just practically, the way you taught someone something they needed to know. She was a poor shot. He told her so, without cruelty. She told him she was aware. He said she'd get better with practice and made her do it again until she'd at least hit the fence post she was aiming for twice out of 6, and then they walked back in the cold, and that was that. Jonah watched all of this from his usual distance. She sometimes caught him looking, at her with the children, at the children with her, with an expression she was still not certain how to read. He was not a man who moved quickly on anything internal. He moved quickly when something required action and slowly when something required feeling, and she respected that because it was not so different from her own nature, she thought, though she had less practice at the slow-moving part. He said something to her one evening in the second week of December that she turned over for days afterward. They had been talking about the spring, practically, about what needed doing on the ranch when the ground softened and what the cattle situation looked like. And he had said, in the middle of that conversation, with the same tone he used for practical things, "I've been thinking about what this looks like, going forward, for you and the children, whether—" He stopped, started differently. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation." "I know," she said. "I want to—" He stopped again. The lamplight was the same as always, the kitchen the same, his hands around his coffee cup the same. "I don't want you to feel like you have to stay because there's nowhere to go," he said. "I want you to stay because you want to be here. There's a difference." She looked at him. "I know there's a difference," she said. "I'm here because I want to be here." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "Jonah?" she said. "Yes. I know you're asking something more than what you said out loud," she said. "And I think when things are—" She paused. "After this business with Langford is finished, when things are settled, I'd like to have that conversation properly." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face, in the careful, controlled surface of it, loosened just slightly. "Yes," he said. I'd like that too. They went back to talking about the spring. The Christmas gathering was at Hatch's place, as planned, a long, low-ceilinged house that was somehow warm despite the cold outside, the wood stove enormous and working hard. And by late afternoon on the 23rd, there were perhaps 40 people filling it. The settlement families from miles around, people Evelyn had met in fragments over the past months and was now meeting assembled. There was food on every surface and children underfoot, and the specific warm noise of people who have survived a hard year together and are briefly celebrating that fact. She had been watching the door. Jonah was talking to Hatch near the back window. Mason was with a group of the older boys and carrying himself like the oldest, which he was. Nora was with two girls her age that she clearly knew well, saying little but present. Luke had found other 8-year-olds and vanished into whatever children vanish into at gatherings. Ivy was asleep on a pile of coats in the corner because 5-year-olds have their own schedule regardless of the occasion. Doyle had come. He was near the door, not obviously positioned, but there, his coat still on, his hat in his hand. He had told Jonah that morning that the federal records from Helena had arrived and were in his office, certified and complete, and that his contact in Boston had sent a wire. Garrett was interested. Not yet here, not in time for today, but interested in coming. She was watching the door when it opened and Victor Langford walked in. He looked exactly as she remembered him, which was somehow the most disturbing thing. The years and the miles, and the everything that had changed for her. And he was just the same, tall, well-dressed by the standards of any place. His coat the good wool kind, his manner the kind that came from long practice at entering rooms and assuming they arranged themselves around him. He was not physically imposing. He was imposing in this way of men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered to them, which was a different kind of imposing and in some ways worse. He had a man with him, younger, thick-built, the kind of man who served a specific function. Langford's eyes moved around the room and found her in perhaps 4 seconds, which told her he'd known exactly where to look, that someone had described the gathering to him, and she felt the old response, the physical one, the shrinking. And then she felt something else override it, something steadier, and she stood where she was and did not move toward the wall. The room had quieted, not fully, but enough. The arrival of 2 obvious strangers in heavy city coats in a frontier settlement gathering was the kind of thing that registered, and several conversations had paused. Langford moved toward her. Doyle had straightened near the door, his attention sharpened. Jonah had seen. She didn't look at him, but she felt the shift in the room from his direction. Langford stopped 6 feet from her. Up close, he looked slightly more weathered than she remembered, slightly more, but pressed, as though something in him was under greater pressure than it had been. Or perhaps she was just looking at him differently. "Evelyn, he said. His voice was the same. Easy, low, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "You've come quite a long way." "I have," she said. "I've been looking for you for a long time." "I know," she said. He glanced around the room, at the people watching, at the low ceiling and the crowded space and the obvious fact that this was not the private confrontation he'd planned for. Something flickered in his expression, brief and controlled. "Perhaps we could speak privately," he said. "I don't think so," she said. He looked at her, a pause. "You understand that I have legal matters to discuss," he said, shifting the frame of it, as he always did, away from the personal, toward the technical, toward the language of authority that was harder to refuse. "Regarding certain arrangements that were made in Boston, agreements that were not honored." "There were no agreements," she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of how steady it was because she had not expected it to be quite this steady, and the steadiness was helping her, the sound of her own voice coming out clean and clear. "There were things that were done to me that I did not agree to. Those are different things." "Evelyn." He said her name with a particular quality, a warning wrapped in patience, the tone of a man demonstrating his restraint. "Her name is Mrs. Cole," Jonah said. He had come up beside her. She had not heard him cross the room, but there he was, not touching her, just standing beside her, and he was looking at Langford with an expression she had not seen on him before, the flat, final look of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it. Langford looked at Jonah. The assessment happened visibly, the way Langford always assessed things, quick, practiced, calculating. She could see him measuring Jonah against the men he was used to dealing with, the Boston financiers and lawyers and officials who operated on the currencies of social position and money. He found him different from those men. She saw him register that difference. "You're the rancher," Langford said. "I am," Jonah said. "Then you may want to hear about the status of your land title," Langford said. He produced a document from his coat, folded papers, several pages, the official-looking kind. "I have had counsel review the original filing through the Helena Land Office, and there are questions about the legitimacy of—" "The title is clean," Jonah said. "I have the certified record from the Federal Land Office in Helena, filed, renewed, and documented." He did not raise his voice. He did not take the papers Langford was offering. "You can take whatever counsel prepared those documents and tell them to examine the federal record." Langford was quiet for a half-second, which from him was the equivalent of a longer pause from anyone else. "There are still matters regarding Evelyn that—" "There are no matters," Evelyn said. "I left Boston of my own free will. I have made my own choices about where I live and how. I owe you nothing. I agreed to nothing, and I will not discuss anything with you here or anywhere else." "There is a pattern of behavior," Doyle said, from the door. He had moved, she realized, closer, and was now within a few feet of Langford. He had the particular unhurried quality of a man who is doing something he knows he has the authority to do. "That matches complaints on record in Boston. Arson, among other things." Langford looked at Doyle. His expression had gone careful. "I'm Sheriff Ben Doyle," Doyle said, "and I'm asking you and your man here to come with me." "I haven't done anything in your jurisdiction," Langford said. His voice was still controlled, still easy, but there was something underneath it now, a quality she recognized from before, the particular register of a man who is accustomed to being in control of a situation and is becoming aware that he might not be. "The fire on the coal property occurred in my jurisdiction," Doyle said. "A man was seen leaving town in the direction of that property 2 days before the fire. I have several questions I'd like to ask. You're welcome to answer them voluntarily, or I can make it less voluntary. Either way, you're going to answer them." Langford looked around the room, at the faces watching him. The settlement families, the ranchers, people who had spent years in this territory and knew each other and knew the Coles and knew what they were looking at. He looked at Jonah. He looked at Evelyn. "I want my lawyer," he said. "You're welcome to send for him," Doyle said pleasantly. "Helena's not so far. He can meet us at my office." The man Langford had brought took a step forward, and Doyle said, very quietly, "I wouldn't." And something in his voice or his posture, or simply the fact of his authority in this room full of people who recognized it, stopped the man. Langford straightened. She had seen him do this before, the moment when he absorbed a setback and rearranged himself around it. The particular pride of a man who cannot admit to others that he has been wrong, even when he knows it privately. He put the documents back in his coat. "This isn't finished," he said, and she wasn't sure if he was saying it to her, or to Jonah, or to the room generally. "It's finished enough for today," Doyle said. "Gentlemen." He walked them out. The door closed behind them, and the room was very quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that follows something large. And then Hatch said, from the back of the room, in his slow, deliberate voice, "Well, anyone need more coffee?" And the room unlocked itself, and people began to talk and move again, and a child somewhere started crying about something unrelated, and the gathering resumed around the fact of what had just happened, the way water moves around a stone. Evelyn stood where she was. Jonah was still beside her. She looked at him. He looked at her. His expression had come back to itself, the composed surface. But it was different from the composed surface of the first months. She knew him well enough now to see past the surface, and what was under it was not the weariness and grief she had first seen there, but something else, something more present. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Her hands had been shaking since Langford walked through the door and were only now beginning to steady. Her chest was doing something complicated. She was standing in a room full of people in a house in Montana in December, and she had just looked at Victor Langford and said what she'd said, and she was still standing. "Yes," she said. "I think so." Mason appeared at her other side. She hadn't seen him come over. He was looking at the door where Langford and his man had gone out, with an expression that was both young and very old. "Is it done?" he said. "Not completely," she said honestly. "But today is done." He nodded. Good enough, he said, and went back to where the other boys were. And she heard him a moment later, saying something to them. And the small, normal noise of it, of a teenage boy talking to other teenage boys at a Christmas gathering, was the best sound she'd heard all day. Jonah put his hand on her arm, briefly, the same checking gesture he'd made in the barnyard after the fire, making sure she was solid and standing. She was. Come on, he said. Hatch's wife made something she called cake. I'm not sure it is exactly, but it's hot, and it's sweet. She almost laughed. She let herself finally, and the laugh came out a little rough but real. That sounds like exactly what I need, she said. They went to find it. Doyle kept Langford and his man in Bitter Creek for 3 days. She knew this because Hatch came by the morning after the gathering with the particular satisfied expression of a man who has watched something deserve to happen finally happen. And he told Jonah that Doyle had put both men in the jailhouse overnight on the basis of the arson investigation, and that Langford's lawyer had indeed come from Helena, arriving the following afternoon looking irritated and cold and entirely unprepared for the quality of evidence Doyle had assembled. The certified land records. Evelyn's written account. The testimony of 2 Bitter Creek residents who had seen Langford's man leave town on the day before the fire, heading northeast on the Cole Road. And a wire from Federal Marshal Garrett in Boston, arriving the second morning, that contained information about Langford's prior conduct that made the Helena lawyer's expression go from irritated to something more carefully neutral, the expression of a lawyer recalculating his position. Evelyn did not go into town during those 3 days. She stayed on the ranch and worked because the work was there, and because staying busy was better than sitting with the uncertainty, which she had always known and had no reason to unlearn now. She repaired the gap in the kitchen window that had been letting cold in since October. She finished the section of quilt she and Nora had been working on. She made 4 batches of bread, which was more bread than the household needed in any reasonable time frame, and Jonah ate 2 slices at every meal without comment, which she appreciated. On the 3rd morning, Doyle came out himself. She saw him coming from the kitchen window. The sheriff's horse on the road, moving at a steady pace in the thin winter sun. And she went to the door and called to Jonah, who was in the repaired section of the barn with Mason checking the new framing. They came in from the cold, and the 4 of them, Doyle, Jonah, Mason, and Evelyn, sat at the kitchen table because the kitchen was always where things happened in this house, and Doyle put his hat on the table and told them what he knew. Langford was being charged with arson and criminal intimidation under territorial law. The evidence was sufficient for Doyle's purposes. The federal interest from Garrett in Boston had added weight that even Langford's Helena lawyer could not easily argue around, because Garrett had found, in the Boston records, a woman named Ruth Carey who had been willing to talk. After years of silence and the specific fear that came from being frightened by a powerful man, Ruth Carey had looked at a federal marshal with official papers and decided that the silence had cost her enough. She had talked for 2 hours. Her account, combined with Evelyn's written statement and the physical evidence from the Cole property, had been enough. He'll fight the charges, Doyle said. He said it plainly, without apology, because Doyle was not a man who softened facts to make them easier. Men like Langford don't just accept the outcome. His lawyer is already talking about challenging the territorial jurisdiction, about the federal involvement being overreach. Will that work? Jonah said. I talked to Garrett about that specifically, Doyle said. Garrett thinks not. The arson is territorial. The intimidation crosses into federal when a federal complaint is involved, and the Boston record gives him grounds to pursue the broader case there independently. He paused. It's going to take time. Could be a year, could be more, before the legal process runs its full course. Evelyn was looking at the table. She had expected this. She had known from the beginning that the end of Victor Langford would not be clean or sudden. Men like him had too many layers between themselves and consequence, too much money, and too many people whose livelihoods depended on their freedom to allow for clean or sudden. But layers could be stripped away, one by one, if someone was patient enough and had enough help. But he's gone from here, she said. It came out as a statement, checking it. He left yesterday, Doyle said. Lawyer posted bail, and they were on the eastbound train by afternoon. He looked at her directly. He's been told, formally and in writing, to stay out of Montana territory pending the investigation. Violating that is a separate charge. She nodded. I think he'll comply, Doyle said. Not because he's a good man, he's not, but because his lawyer knows the situation has changed. He can't come here and operate the way he did in Boston. The ground's different here. The ground is different here, Jonah said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. He was looking at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and the thing in his expression was something she had seen only in parts before, in small moments. Now it was complete, unguarded, and fully visible. Doyle left after a cup of coffee and a brief conversation with Jonah about the spring, the practical and territorial kind of conversation that men in this part of the world conducted around whatever else was happening in their lives, because the land and the weather continued regardless of human drama and required their attention. Then his horse was on the road going back toward town, and it was just the ranch and the sky and the cold and the family in the house. Mason, who had listened to all of it without speaking, said on his way back to the barn, "Good. One word. Flat and complete." Then he went out, and the door closed behind him, and Evelyn heard the sound of him crossing the yard in the snow. She stood in the kitchen for a moment by herself. Jonah had gone back to the barn with Mason, the children, Luke and Nora, and Ivy, who had been kept away from the adult conversation in the front room with schoolwork and the bribe of dried apple slices, were audible in the other room, the low sound of children occupied. The kitchen was warm. The bread she'd made that morning was cooling on the shelf. She stood there and breathed for a moment, just breathed, and let herself feel what the last 3 months had actually been, the full weight of it now that the acute danger had moved back far enough to let the weight be felt. She had come to this territory with 17 cents and nothing behind her worth returning to. She had been rejected by 23 men in a cold church and chosen by one who hadn't said much more than, "I have a ranch and 4 children and the winters here are serious." She had burned her arm on an unfamiliar stove. She had fallen off a horse. Not quite. She had almost fallen off a horse, 3 times. She had sat up in blizzards and gone into a burning barn and written 6 pages of the worst years of her life onto paper in plain, clear sentences and handed them to a sheriff. She was still here. This was not nothing. She wanted to be clear with herself about that because she had a tendency, which she recognized as a tendency, to absorb difficulty as simple fact and keep moving without acknowledging that the moving itself had cost something, that the staying had not been free or easy, that it had required more of her than she had known she had. It had required that, and she had had it. She was still here. The new year came in quietly on the Cole Ranch. Christmas itself had been modest and warm. The gathering at Hatch's place had been the big social event, and the day itself was the family and their own table and the small gifts that Evelyn had managed from what she could put together, practical things mostly, though she had found a piece of ribbon in Bitter Creek when she'd gone in with Jonah the week before and braided it into Ivy's hair on Christmas morning, which Ivy regarded as possibly the finest thing that had ever happened to her. Mason received a new pair of work gloves, proper ones that fit his hands, and he tried them on at the table with the studied neutrality of a teenager who has not yet decided whether he's allowed to be pleased by things, which Evelyn found unexpectedly moving. Nora asked for nothing and received a small book of mathematics problems that Doyle had happened to mention Evelyn was looking for and that he'd found at the general store in Bitter Creek, and Nora held it for a long moment without saying anything, and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that was Nora's version of overcome, which was almost exactly the same as Nora's version of calm, except for the slight extra stillness around her eyes. Luke wanted to know if he could have a dog. "No," Jonah said. "When can I have a dog?" "When you're responsible enough for a dog." "How will I know when I'm responsible enough?" "I'll tell you," Jonah said. Luke appeared to find this a reasonable arrangement and moved on. The conversation Evelyn and Jonah had agreed to have, the proper one, the one that went beyond the practical, happened 2 days after Christmas, on a cold, still afternoon when the children were occupied and the ranch was quiet, and Jonah came into the kitchen and sat down at the table with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it regardless of how uncomfortable the execution is. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table and waited. He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. She had come to know this about him, that the silence before he said something important was not hesitation exactly, but preparation, the way you stand still before picking up something heavy, making sure your footing is right. "I'm not good at saying things this kind," he said. "I want to be clear about that from the start, so you understand that whatever comes out is the truth, even if it doesn't come out right." "I know that," she said. "You came here with nothing," he said, "and I gave you—" Not much better than nothing. A cot in a room off the kitchen and 4 children who made your life difficult and a barn that burned down and a dangerous man from your past following you into it. He stopped. That's not what I intended. I intended to offer you something decent. You offered me something real, she said. That's not the same as nothing. He looked at her. I'm trying to ask you something, he said. I know, she said. Go ahead. He was quiet for another moment. Then, I don't know how to do this again. I want to be honest about that. The first time I wasn't thinking about how to do it. I was just young and certain the way young people are certain. And Claire and I built something and it was good. It was genuinely good and then it was gone. He stopped. I'm not young anymore and I'm not certain. I'm asking carefully because I've already lost something I can't get back. And I'm careful now about what I let myself have. She sat with that. She understood what it had cost him to say it, and she didn't rush past it. I'm careful too, she said. For different reasons, but the same kind of careful. He nodded. I know, he said. That's part of why I'm asking. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. Will you stay? Not the arrangement we started with, as my wife, properly, as the children's mother. A pause. As mine. The last word came out quieter than the rest, the particular quiet of something that costs something to say. She looked at him. The kitchen was the same as always. The stove, the shelf with the bread, the window with the mended gap, the lamp that would need its oil topped off before evening. This ordinary, difficult, real place that she had learned month by month until it had become the place she knew. Yes, she said, I'll stay. He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a few seconds, and then he sat back and said, I think we should do it on New Year's Day. If Doyle can come out, he's a justice of the peace as well. He is? She said. He is, Jonas said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was in the neighborhood. New Year's Day, she said. All right. She told the children that evening. She sat them down at the kitchen table, Mason and Nora and Luke and Ivy, the 4 of them arranged as they always were. Mason at the end, Ivy in the corner where she could reach the edge of the table, Luke between them, and Nora across. And she told them plainly that she and their father were going to be married on New Year's Day, and that this was what she wanted, and that she wanted to know what they thought about it. The silence lasted 3 full seconds, which was long for this table. Then Ivy said, Does that mean you're staying forever? Yes, Evelyn said. Ivy appeared to process this with the complete seriousness of someone for whom forever is not an abstraction, but a practical matter. Okay, she said, and went back to the wooden horse she'd been moving around the table edge. Luke said, Can I still get a dog? That's between you and your father, she said. So you're going to be our mother, Nora said. She said it carefully, feeling the edges of the word. I'm going to be what I've been, Evelyn said. I'm not going to be Clara. I'm not trying to replace her, and I wouldn't know how to, but I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be yours, if that's all right. Nora looked at her for a long time with those grave, reading eyes. She would have liked you, Nora said finally. Mama. She didn't like people who weren't real. Evelyn had to look at the table for a moment. Thank you, she said. That means a great deal to me. She looked at Mason last. He had been quiet through all of it, his hands flat on the table, not looking at her and not looking away. When her gaze landed on him, he met it directly. You're going to fight with him sometimes, Mason said. My father, he has opinions. I know, she said, and he doesn't apologize easily. I've noticed. And sometimes he works when he should be. Here, inside, with us. She held his gaze. I know that too, she said. I've noticed that too. Mason was quiet for another moment. Then, okay, he said. Just that. Okay. In exactly the same tone he'd used after Doyle left, one word, flat and complete, and it meant what it always meant for Mason, which was, I've decided. I'm in. She breathed. New Year's Day came in clear and very cold, and the house filled with people in a way it had not been filled before because word had gotten out. The way things got out in the settlement, through Hatch and the other ranchers, and the simple fact of people knowing each other's business because the distances made them neighbors in a way that city people didn't understand. And by the time Doyle arrived at 11 in the morning, there were already 8 people in the house, and more coming through the door behind him. Evelyn stood in the kitchen in her best dress, which was not a wedding dress in any formal sense but was the better of her two. And Nora had insisted on braiding her hair in a way she'd apparently seen Clara wear hers for occasions. And Ivy had contributed a piece of dried flour from somewhere that was now tucked above Evelyn's ear. And she looked at herself briefly in the small mirror in her room and thought, well, this is what we have. This is real and imperfect and completely mine. She went out to the front room where Jonah was standing by the window in his good coat, the one he reserved for Bitter Creek, which she'd mended a loose button on the previous week. And he turned when she came in and looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen on him and would not have had a word for anyway, something open and careful and entirely real. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. Doyle stood them in front of the window with the cold white light of New Year's Day coming through it, and the room crowded and warm behind them, and performed the ceremony, which was short because Doyle was a practical man, and because there was food waiting, and because the significant thing was not the length of the words but the fact of them. When it was done and the room made its noise, the particular happy noise of people who have come somewhere cold to witness something good and mean it. Mason was the first of the children to come forward. He stood in front of them with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at his father and then at Evelyn and then said, in his plain, direct way, "Good." And then he did something she had not expected. He put his arms around her briefly, the slightly awkward embrace of a teenage boy who is not practiced at embraces, and then stepped back and went to find something to eat before anyone could make anything of it. Luke, who had no concerns about making things of things, threw himself at both of them simultaneously and had to be disentangled. Nora stood with her hands folded and her chin up and said, "I'm glad," with the precision of someone who has chosen those words over several other options. And Evelyn understood that those 2 words from Nora were the equivalent of a speech from anyone else. And Ivy climbed up into Evelyn's arms, which she had taken to doing with the ease of a child who has decided this is simply one of the available options, and said into her ear with great confidentiality, "I told Chester you were staying forever." "What did Chester think about that?" Evelyn asked. "He took my hat," Ivy said, with the resigned dignity of someone long accustomed to Chester's opinions. The day went the way good days do, which is to say imperfectly and warmly and full of small things that didn't go quite right and were fine anyway. Hatch's wife, a small fierce woman named Dora, who had opinions about bread and shared them, declared Evelyn's biscuits acceptable, which is high praise from Dora, according to Hatch, said with the equanimity of a man who had been married to Dora for 30 years. A child knocked over a cup of something, and it stained the tablecloth, and nobody made much of it. 2 of the older ranchers argued about fence line regulations for 40 minutes in the corner, and then agreed to disagree and ate another plate of food. Luke found someone who had a dog and spent an hour in earnest negotiation about what exactly it would take to be considered responsible enough. Jonah stood beside her for most of the afternoon, not performing anything, not making gestures, just there, the way he was there in the barn and at the table and on the trail in the cold, that physical presence that she had learned over months to read as its own kind of language. At one point, when the room was at its noisiest and most crowded, and she had been on her feet for several hours and was beginning to feel it, he appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee and said nothing, just handed it to her and went back to the conversation he'd been in, and she held the cup and thought, "This is the shape of it. This is what this is." It was not what she had imagined in the brief and guarded moments before Boston when she had let herself imagine things. It was not the smooth narrative of 2 people finding each other and building something together without the mess of grief and damage and children who tested you and winters that tried to kill you and dangerous men from the past arriving at Christmas gatherings in good coats. It was harder than that and more specific and in some ways more than she had imagined, not in spite of the difficulty but alongside it. The way things that cost something are worth more than the things that don't. After the guests had gone and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet again with the specific quality of quiet that follows a full day of noise, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee cup and looked out at the dark yard, at the barn with its repaired east section, at the land rolling away into the Montana dark. The stars were out in the way they were only in this kind of cold, and this kind of clear, sharp, and very numerous, closer to the earth than any city sky ever let you see. Jonah came and stood beside her. He had his own cup, and he looked out at the same dark she was looking at, and they stood together in the kitchen window light with the warmth of the house around them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Boston," she said. "Not the bad parts, just the distance, how far away it is." "Does that feel like a good thing or a bad thing?" "A good thing," she said. "A very good thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "when I walked into that church in Bitter Creek and you told me 23 men had already said no, I thought, what kind of fools are these men?" She looked at him. His expression was straight, not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "You didn't say that at the time," she said. "No," he said. "I wasn't going to open with that." She laughed, a real one, the rough kind that came out when she wasn't managing it. He glanced at her with the small shift in his expression that she had learned over months was what a smile looked like on Jonah Cole, the contained version of it, the real one that didn't perform itself. 23 men, she said. "Fools," he said simply, and drank his coffee. She looked back out the window at the land. This land. She was still learning it, would be learning it for years probably, because this kind of country didn't give itself up quickly and expected to be known over time, through seasons and difficulties and the slow accumulation of days. She had one winter in it. One winter was a beginning. She thought about what she would tell herself if she could speak to the woman who had stepped off the train in Bitter Creek with 17 cents and a brown coat that wasn't warm enough. She wasn't sure she would tell her anything, actually. She wasn't sure the telling would be useful or that the woman standing on that platform could have understood what the knowing would cost or what it would give back. Some things you can only learn by going through them, which is not a comforting truth, but is a true one. What she would want that woman to know, the one gripping the platform railing with both hands in the 11 below dark, was not that everything would be fine. Because not everything would be fine. The barn would burn, and Langford would come, and there would be nights of real fear and mornings of genuine exhaustion, and days when the cold was not a romantic adversary, but just cold, relentless and indifferent, and prepared to outlast you. She would not tell her that it would be fine. She would tell her, "You will find out what you're made of, and it will be more than you think." She would tell her, "The people who choose you imperfectly and stay anyway are worth more than the ones who would have chosen you easily." She would tell her, chosen family is still family. Maybe it's the realest kind because it didn't happen by accident. It happened because people looked at each other honestly and decided. Because a 14-year-old boy came to trust you slowly and on his own terms. Because a 5-year-old climbed into your arms and a serious girl taught you her mother's bread technique, and a man who had learned to grieve quietly, learned alongside you to let himself have something again. She would tell her, "The thing you're afraid of does not get to decide who you become. You do." She would tell her to go ahead and get on the wagon. "Jonah," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad you walked into that church." He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet when he was deciding to say a thing rather than leave it where it was. "So am I," he said. They stood at the window together until the coffee was gone, and the cold outside had done its work on the glass, frosting the lower edge of the pane. Then she washed the cups the way she washed the cups every night, and he banked the fire the way he banked the fire every night, and they went to their rooms. Their room now, though the word still had a new feeling to it, like a coat you've just put on for the first time that fits but isn't worn in yet. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the particular creaks of a log house in deep cold, the horses in the barn shifting and blowing, the wind, distant tonight, not aggressive, just present. Above her, in the room she had learned to navigate in the dark, the children slept. Mason, with whatever dreams a 14-year-old who has been through what he's been through, keeps to himself. Nora with her mathematical precision and her mother's mouth. Luke sprawled and easy the way he always slept. Ivy curled small with the wooden horse tucked against her. 5 months. She had been here 5 months, and the ranch was inside her now, its sounds and rhythms and temperatures, the way certain floorboards complained, the particular way the kitchen stove sounded when it was running right, and the way it sounded when it wasn't. The land outside the window with its moods and its cold beauty and its absolute refusal to be managed or sentimentalized. The four children with their separate and complete natures, their specific griefs and specific humor and specific ways of coming to trust. The man sleeping beside her for the first time in his own bed, with the gray at his temples and the deep running weariness that was a little lighter than it had been in January, who had walked into a church too late and chosen her without hesitation and meant by it everything he'd said and said less than everything he'd meant, who was learning, the same as she was, how to be this, present, available, open to something after loss. She was not a woman who believed in easy. She had not been offered easy and had stopped expecting it young, and she did not expect it now. The legal matter with Langford would run its course over the coming year and require attention, and would not be without its difficult days. The ranch would have hard winters yet, and things that broke and seasons that didn't cooperate. Mason would not become easy. He would become different kinds of difficult as he moved from 14 toward whatever he was going to be, and that was right. That was exactly right, because easy was not what she wanted from him. She wanted him real. All of it would be what it would be, which was the only thing it could ever be. She had 17 cents when she arrived. She had left with nothing, and she had arrived with nothing, and she had built something out of the nothing. Not alone. Never alone. That was the lesson. That was the whole of it. But with these specific people in this specific cold place, one day at a time, one batch of bread, and one mended coat, and one burning barn, and one long winter night at a time. She thought about Ruth Carey in Boston, who had finally talked to a federal marshal after years of silence, who had found, wherever she was, enough solid ground to stand on and speak from. She thought about what it cost to stay silent and what it cost to speak, and how the second cost, which felt impossible in the dark, turned out to be survivable in the light. She would write to Ruth Carey in the spring. She didn't know if the letter would find her. She would write it anyway. She thought about Doyle, who had come out on New Year's Day in the cold and done his job with the particular dignity of a man who understood what his job was actually for, which was not enforcement of rules but protection of people's right to their own lives. She thought about Hatch and his wife Dora, who said acceptable and meant it as high praise, and the ranchers who came with timber after the fire, and the settlement families who had watched Langford walk into that gathering and had stayed where they were, solid, present, a community that recognized what it was looking at. She thought about all of it, the whole strange, difficult, improbable chain of events that had brought her to this room, this ranch, this dark, this life. Then she stopped thinking and listened to the horse moving in the barn, somewhere out there in the Montana night, the soft, certain sound of an animal in shelter. And she let herself be here, fully and without reservation, in this life she had chosen and that had chosen her back, and she closed her eyes. Outside, the stars held. The land held. The cold did what cold does, settled deep and permanent, but inside the house the fire Jonah had banked gave it slow heat, moving room to room the way warmth does in a well-built house, finding the children in their beds, and the woman who had stayed, and the man who had finally, carefully, let himself begin again. It held.